Chapter 131, Madara Kakashi Tobirama, the one where you have a telepathic link. Kakashi winced as another hot flash of irritation rang through his mind, his mouth tugging wryly to one side and his steps quickening. Sometimes he seriously questioned the fates for gifting him with two such volatile men as his soulmates when they clearly had this much trouble getting along without some kind of buffer between them. When he stepped through the door of the home they all shared, however, it was to see something so rare that he was tempted to find a calendar just to mark the occasion. Both of them were irritated, but it wasn't at each other. Tobirama and Madara stood side by side against one wall of the den, arms crossed and shoulders pressed together, in silent support while they stared down at the figure on the other side of the room with all the malice and confused irritation they usually saved for a particularly clever enemy. On the couch there sat a bassinet overflowing with lacy blankets and two tiny fists sticking out the sides. Kakashi watched for a moment until the fingers twitched just to make sure the baby was still alive before he returned his gaze to his pair of grubby soulmates, very glad of the mask which hid his smile. "We can feel you laughing at us," Madara pointed out with a growl. Kakashi shrugged. "At least I am polite enough not to do so out loud. HMPH. As if that makes such a difference." Carefully assessing both of them, trying to be subtle about his mental probing, Kakashi determined Tobirama to be the less irritated between them if only by the slightest margin. A few careful steps had him slipping up behind the man to drop a chin on his shoulder. One hand curled around the pale man's hip while the other reached over to stroke soothingly at Madara's lower back, cautious of the usual backlash. Neither of his partners accepted comfort very easily. "Ma, can I ask why we have a baby?" he said. "Nobody stole that thing, right?" They both huffed and ripples of slight offense hit him from both sides. "Why on earth would either of us steal a baby?" Madara demanded. "That is my brother's spawn," Tobirama grumbled over top of him, his entire body tense and drawn away from the unmoving source of his ire. "He had something come up, so he asked us to watch the thing for a couple of hours. And you're doing exactly that, I see, just standing here and watching." Both of his partners turned their heads to give him withering looks, and he could feel that his words had offended them even more, not helping their bad moods at all. He wondered just how long ago Hashirama had dumped a child in the household and whether or not he expected to get the bait back from these men in the same condition as when it arrived. Tobirama was rather well known for his love of children, but there was a marked difference between children and babies. Children could speak and be reasoned with, could communicate their desires, whereas all babies did was poop and cry while any adults close by were left to wonder what exactly was wrong. With the bassinet so full of blankets he couldn't see anything more from this angle than the small fists opening and closing, but Kakashi was prepared to take them at their word about it being Hashirama's child. He didn't really want to get any closer himself to confirm. Did he say when he would be back? At his question the other two gave matching snorts of disgust. "Of course not, when does that oaf plan anything properly?" Madara snapped. Rather than defend his brother, Tobirama simply nodded with an old sort of suffering in his eyes. "What are we supposed to do with it?" Silence fell, heavily tinged with reluctance from both of his partners, until finally Tobirama turned his head to look away and mumbled under his breath, he said, "To watch it." "So, as you so inanely pointed out, we are watching it." Kakashi wanted to laugh, he truly did, but the urge was stifled by the knowledge that he would have done little better if presented with the same situation. What did people even do with babies? What was the point of them? Of the few occasions he had spent any amount of time with Hashirama's child, all he had ever seen it do was gobble and flail its limbs about. And poop, of course. And wail. This baby was particularly good at wailing, he had noticed. "Well, there goes my afternoon plans, I suppose." He heaved a sigh while his partners both turned to give him curious looks. "Plans?" Madara prompted him. Kakashi let his lips turn up in a wicked smirk and stood up on the tips of his toes to press a quick kiss to Tobirama's cheek, dropped back down to his heels so he could lean over and do the same for Madara, then stepped back and wandered away towards the kitchen. "I knew you were both home today, and I had thought that it would be the perfect opportunity to try that gift you both got me for my birthday." He didn't have to look over his shoulder to feel the twin surges of startled lust directed at him, thoughts of the wicked items hidden under the bed dancing through all three of their minds simultaneously. He was quick enough to make it out of the room before either of them could react to his statement, but there was no outrunning the telepathic link which connected them all as soulmates. Later, Madara and Tobirama silently promised him at the same time that single word accompanied with all the hot excitement coursing through their thoughts at the moment. Kakashi smirked and set them both a mental image of what he would look like when that later came around just to torture them a bit. Judging by the emotions he could read from them in return, he was going to feel the punishment for that later, but oh, what a wonderful punishment it promised to be. Chapter 132, Kiba Gaara, the one where you glow on first contact. Well, we made it to the tower. Now what? Kiba swung his head from side to side, looking around at the seemingly empty tower. Wait, are we the first ones here? Yeah. Teammate is so awesome. Not quite on either account, a feminine voice came from the shadows. Kiba spun around with his teammates to see three of the genin from Suna standing on an elevated walkway a floor above them, the girl leaning over the railing to smirk tauntingly down at the new arrivals. Her brother leaned over next to her and laughed. Yeah, you guys are neither first nor awesome. We've been here for hours already. Instantly irritated, Kiba made a fist and shook it up at the three foreign shinobi. Well, you guys must have cheated to have gotten here so fast. No, the youngest of them denied in his wispy voice. We are simply better than you. You can know how shinobi are weak, unwilling to kill. Useless caring for pointless human lives is what slowed you down, and that is why you will never be achieve true strength. Kiba stared at the boy and wondered if he was actually serious. He couldn't really be that cold-hearted, could he? To call human lives useless like that, he had to be some kind of psychopath. Anyone with at least some kind of feelings wouldn't be so eager to kill the way this boy gave the impression of being. Irritated by such a flagrant disregard for other people, Kiba peeled back his lips and snarled up at the trio above them. Behind him he could hear Hinata's quiet protests for him not to start a fight, but it was too late. He was already fired up. With both fists clenched, he turned and headed for the stairs, feet stomping on the tiled floor in what he hoped was an impressive display of temper, his eyes locked onto the idiot he was about to give a piece of his mind to, and absolutely nothing was going to stop the whirlwind he intended to create. Akamori yipped in annoyed solidarity from where the small pup was resting inside his jacket. At the top of the stairs, the three Suna genin met him in a line, all three of them with their arms crossed. Kiba glared at the other two in turns before settling his eyes on the one who had insulted him the worst. It rankled that he had to stand looking up at someone who would clearly be shorter than him if they were on the same level, but since he couldn't pass by them to reach the top steps, he would simply have to bear it. What do you know about strength? He snarled. My mom's really strong. All Konoha shinobi are really strong. You are an ant and it will be only too easy to crush you. The words themselves were unsettling enough, but when paired with the absolute lack of inflection in the boy's voice, they became positively spine-chilling. Kiba gnashed his teeth together and tried not to look as rattled as he felt. Say that to my face, he blustered. One of the other Suna kids, the older boy, gave a snort. He just did, you dumbass. Even more fired up, Kiba raised his fist again and made to step forward, redirecting his anger easily onto a new target. He was stopped by a wall of sand forming in midair and pressing against the middle of his chest, nearly tripping him back down the staircase. Luckily, Hinata and Shina caught up to him just then and were able to support his form so he wouldn't topple over. Let me by. Kiba hollered, blindly striking out with one fist. The sand caught him again just before the blow connected. He must have startled the boy with such an uncoordinated attack, however, because he did manage to get his hand close enough to brush against the cheek he meant to land a punch on. Oh. Kiba-kun. You both glowing. Hinata was right. The spot where his fingers rested almost gently against the younger boy's cheek had lit up with a pale light that seemed to emanate from both of them. It only lasted for a few seconds, but that was enough for everyone present to stop all movements. Only a few seconds had passed before the boy jerked away from him with something wild in his eyes, something Kiba couldn't quite identify. It looked a little like panic, a little like devastation, a little like heartbreak, all of it together but muffled underneath the clouded features of someone who had so easily threatened him with death less than a minute ago. It was impossible to tell what the other was thinking at the moment, and Kiba wasn't given the chance to ask any questions. Temari, Kankuro, let's wait somewhere else. Are you sure? The girl asked carefully. Gaara, that's your. I said let's go. Right. While the older two eyed him over their shoulders, the boy with the red hair turned and walked away without so much as a single word on the subject. Kiba stood rooted to the ground with shock and watched his soulmate walk away with little hope that he would turn around and come back. Not very much time had passed when they met again, somewhat less than 3 months in fact. Kiba's mind was far from a boy he had met only once as he sat in his hospital bed and worried over the state of his injured dog. More so than his own injuries, he had been fretting about Akamaru since he woke up again after the battle with Yukon and Seikan during the failed attempt at stopping Sasuke from leaving Konoha village. His sister had only just left him alone to rest when another shadow appeared in his doorway. Sleepily, Kiba let his head roll to the side to see who else had come to visit him. There weren't many options with half of his friends stuck in their own beds in various parts of the hospital. Word was that Choji was still in emergency surgery and Niju wasn't out of the woods yet either. Kiba himself was extremely lucky to have survived with the wounds he had taken. He would have to thank Kankuro at some point for showing up at just the right time and carrying him back. Red hair and his blurry vision had him squinting in confusion, trying to imagine who he knew with red hair that would show up in his hospital room. He blinked away the sleep trying to drag him down only to continue blinking in confusion. "Gaara," he rasped. "My brother told me of your battle with the shinobi from Oto de Cure. He says you were very brave." "Ah, well yeah. Of course. I'm always awesome." Kiba coughed when he realized he was slurring his words in his exhaustion. "What are you doing here?" Gaara came closer on silent feet, every line of his body projecting cautiousness. "His description of your injuries worried me and I came to make sure that you are recovering well. Last time I saw you, you wanted to kill me," Kiba pointed out. Gaara had the grace to look contrite. "Yes, I was in a difficult place. Naruto's words showed me a different path that I could follow and I have been working hard to learn from his example. I would like to apologize for my words the last time we saw each other. That was wrong of me. Dan." Nearly forgetting to breathe in his surprise, Kiba struggled through an attempt to sit up. "That was probably the last thing I would have expected you to say. No, do not rise. Your wounds." The other boy hurried the last few steps forward to guide him back down to the pillows where he lay blinking upwards into startlingly green eyes. Several of the medicines currently swirling through his bloodstream were encouraging him to close his eyes and fall asleep, but he battled against the urge, not quite ready for the strange encounter to be over. "It's weird," he slurred. "You caring? When last we met we discovered that we are soulmates. I was not prepared to accept such a thing at the time. In fact, I had given up the idea that anyone could ever be so unlucky as to be my soulmate. Meeting you was unexpected. But now I can say that it is not unwelcome." "All right," Kiba mumbled. Maybe he should have had something more profound to say in return, but sleep had dug its claws in and he was holding on to the world around him by a single thread of consciousness. Gaara tilted his head. "You need rest. I will return when you are more prepared for company." Kiba wrinkled his nose and snuffled feebly in protest, mollified slightly by the warm dusty scent of the other. He hoped Gaara would be able to come back soon. They had a lot of things to talk about. Chapter 133, Gunma's Sakura, the one where first words appear on your arm. As a member of the Hokage Guard, it wasn't really all that difficult to figure out what his duties were supposed to be like on a day-to-day basis. Gunma had been a member of the Hokage Guard since the too-short reign of the Yongdain, had watched over the tenures of 3 different legendary figures, and he could say without a doubt that Senjutsunaid was the most difficult experience of all. Certainly she was an amazing woman and there was no one else he would rather serve under, but Gunma would have been very grateful if she would stop disappearing without telling her guards where she was going. Thursdays weren't a part of his usual roster. For the most part he was usually scheduled for the earlier days of the week to leave him free to take missions in the later half, never anything too serious or far from home but enough to help him keep the sharp edge someone of his position should have. When Radu asked him to cover a Thursday shift out of the blue he'd thought little of it, not expecting anything different than usual. He really should have known better. Just after lunch Tsunatsama stepped out to go to the washroom and did not return for over an hour. Gunma had been frantic by the time she returned, but she'd only laughed at his demands to know where the hell she had been. A girl needs some secrets, she told him. Gunma fumed, but there wasn't much he could do about it. 2 months later, when Radu asked him to cover again, he hadn't thought much about it that time either. Clearly the last disappearance had been an isolated incident and it wouldn't repeat itself a second time, right? Wrong. Just after lunch he found himself guarding an empty office again and receiving nothing more than a knowing laugh an hour later when Tsunae-sama finally returned. Gunma stomped all the way to Radi's house and demanded his friend trade him schedules. He wasn't usually given to petty nosiness, but he also wasn't used to being laughed at like that. Every Thursday after that, Gunma went through the same frustration at the same time just after lunch, and it was clear that his Hokage was enjoying herself. From the way the others on guard rotation snickered at him, he gathered that it wasn't a particularly important secret wherever she was going and that she was keeping him in the dark just to watch him squirm. If he were watching someone else get this frustrated over something so small, he knew he would have laughed right along with the rest of them. Knowing that did not help. In the end, it took just a little over 3 months of Tsunae-sama dodging him in all manner of interesting ways before he finally discovered where she kept disappearing to every Thursday afternoon. Gunma had long taken to scouring the village in that hour, hoping he could find her and reveal the secret for himself. Checking the Forest of Death hadn't even occurred to him as an option until he was passing by the fringes of it on his way to question the border patrol, and a loud cry of "Chanara" caught his attention. His feet automatically changed paths to propel him over the fence and into the trees. Whatever he might have been expecting was immediately wiped from his mind upon reaching a large clearing just in time to see the Hokage's apprentice, Hatate's one-time student, absolutely demolish a tree in a single overpowered punch. Gunma was pretty sure he felt the bottom of his jaw smack the dirt at his feet when it dropped. For such a tiny little slip of a thing, she sure had some power behind that fist. A shiver ran through him as he pictured what might have happened if it were a human body she had connected with rather than a tree. He knew who she was, of course. He'd seen her around the tower a few times, though they had never spoken directly, and Hatate had never held back moaning about his students on the rare occasion they managed to drag him out for drinks. None of those small tidbits of gossip had prepared him for the sight he'd just witnessed, though. "Dan," he mumbled under his breath with a low whistle. As he watched, the girl reared back, gave another shout while Chakra wreathed her fist, then lunged forward to destroy another helpless tree so thick she would need 6 arms to go around it. Impressive, no. He hadn't even noticed Tsunae-sama appearing at his side, so distracted was he by the amazing sight beforehand. Gunma nodded without looking away. "She's really something. I can definitely see your influence, and you'd better. She's worked too hard for you not to see some improvement. Sakura, take a break. Your chakra control is slipping and I won't have a sloppy apprentice." "All right, sure." Immediately the girl drooped into a hasty bow and hurried towards them with a bright smile. She had way too much energy for someone who could cause that much distraction in one hit. Gunma would have thought it would take more out of her, but she made it look effortless. He tried not to be too obvious about his staring when Sakura landed next to them on light feet. "You're right, sure. I need to work on expelling the chakra at the moment of impact instead of beforehand." "Good, you noticed." Tsunae nodded in approval. That was something, kid," Gunma blurted. He resisted the urge to smack himself for sounding so stupid, but it seemed that the girl hadn't noticed. She was staring back at him with wide eyes and clutching the elbow protector covering a portion of her pale arm. When she failed to say anything further, only stood there and continued to gawk at him, Gunma shifted a little uncomfortably. If he had somehow offended her, then she'd just proven she could punch her way straight through his chest. Tsunae-sama didn't seem put off in any way, so he didn't think that was the case, but just to be sure he inched away, glad that his worried expression was hidden behind a porcelain A&B mask. It wouldn't do to show weakness to someone like that. Keeping one eye on her just in case, he turned to his Hokage with an unseeing frown. "So this is where you've been going? Why the secrecy?" "It was fun," she replied with a careless shrug. Gunma's eye twitched. He was in the process of opening his mouth, probably to scream and rant about all the useless frustration she had been putting him through these last few months, when Sakura cut in with a sudden shout. "Soulmates," she cried. Gunma jolted when the mark underneath his long gloves grew warm, where that same single word was written on his skin in precise, neat writing. He whipped his head forward again to find her staring back at him still. "What did you say?" "I meant you're my soulmate." "Holy crap. Language, Tsunade murmured with laughter in her voice. Both of them ignored her. Gunma worked his jaw soundlessly until Sakura darted over to pluck at the bottom of his mask, clearly hoping to push it away and see who was hiding underneath. Unfortunately for her, it was stuck in place with chakra. It took a couple shakes to clear his head enough for Gunma to reach up and cautiously remove it for her, wary of the possibility that she might be disappointed to discover her fate. He was thankful when all she did was give a curious hum. "You're older than I thought you'd be," she said, no judgment in her voice. "But you're really cute, so no biggie." Gunma spluttered. "Calm down, you're not quite old enough yet to be calling me cute. HMPH. I can look all I want. Just, give it a few years before you expect me to start thinking about any of that stuff. Until then, Gunma. I'm Gunma." He thrust a hand towards her awkwardly and she took it with a small laugh. "Sakura," she told him. He nodded at her pink hair. "Yeah, I've heard some things about you. All of them wrong, probably. How about you buy me some dando and I can tell you anything you want to know? That doesn't sound too bad." She grinned openly and took hold of his wrist, marching away while pulling him along behind her like a dog on a leash. Gunma was too stunned to do anything until she waved over her shoulder with a loud "Bye, Shasha. I'll see you next week. You do realize that I'm supposed to be on duty still, right? Meh. I'm more important, aren't I?" He had an inkling that she would grow to be his most important person in the world. Chapter 134, Kakashi Ahana, the one where you hear their thoughts about you. In between blocking a kick from Naruto and ducking a shuriken thrown by Sakura, Kakashi nearly lost his footing as a thought he knew was not his own crashed down on him like a hot wave. We could be having sex on the kitchen floor right now. Naruto gave a war cry which sounded more like a kitten's mew, and Kakashi swallowed thickly as he let himself fall out of the way. His hands reached out by habit to catch Sasuke by the collar and toss him bodily in front of the too obvious incoming punch, mentally noting that he needed to train that out of him, but it was a fleeting thought quickly erased by another. God, I love the way his hands feel between my thighs. Okay. I think that's enough for now, eh? In one smooth motion, Kakashi had all three of his tiny students down on the ground in various states of disorientation. "You guys have been working really hard today, so why don't you go reward yourselves with some dendo?" "But sensei, we've only been training for an hour," Sakura protested in a wheeze, holding her stomach. Naruto bounced up beside her and shook his fist. "Yeah. And you promised that you'd show us how to throw kunai blindfolded today. Did I? HN. Oh well, I suppose that'll have to wait for another day. Later." In a small puff of smoke he was gone, appearing back inside his brightly lit bedroom just in time as another unasked-for thought to intrude upon him. "Wonder if he'll be home when I get there. I hope so. I could use a little tension release." Dragging a hand down his face, Kakashi very carefully did not think about the heat those words had carried or the intent he could feel behind them. He happened to know that his soulmate was currently sitting in a very boring but very official clan meeting surrounded by elders, extended family, and dozens of dods all bred with shinobi-like abilities. It boggled his mind that she could even entertain these thoughts in their presence, let alone hide any physical effects they might have on her body. Slumping down on the mattress, Kakashi dropped his head back on the pillow and closed his eyes, thinking hard about how ridiculous she could be sometimes and hoping she got the message. Kakashi has no sense of humor. His eyes popped back open to glare at the ceiling above him, slightly offended. If some people didn't understand proper social norms, that wasn't his fault, but there was no need to go attacking his sense of humor. He was as fun-loving as anyone, thank you very much. Not for the first time, he wished the connection between soulmates allowed him to communicate more directly, to say things to her rather than awkwardly phrase his thoughts about her. Ignoring the tightening of his pants, Kakashi thought very pointedly about how unamused he was by where his soulmate's attention had drifted. He infused the thought with as much annoyance as he possibly could, but it was no use. "I'll bet I can cheer him up when I get home. He likes me on my knees." Kakashi lay both arms over his eyes and gave into fate. It looked like he was going to have to suffer through listening to all of her dirty thoughts until the clan meet was over and she was able to come home. He hated it when she did this, riling him up when he couldn't go find her. She knew he would prefer to wait for her than to take things into his own hands, so it frequently became a game of who could hold their frustration the longest. Luckily, his suffering only lasted a little more than an hour, barely a fraction of the amount of time she'd made him wait on other occasions. The moment she walked in the door, Kakashi pounced, trapping her up against the wall and absolutely shifting his weight to allow her two hounds to trot past him. Intelligent creatures that they were, and with such enhanced senses, he was more than certain they suspected what was likely about to happen and were on their way to hide under the couch as usual. "You are a filthy woman," Kakashi informed his wife. "What are you gonna do about it, Hatake?" Hana grinned and snapped her teeth at him, and Kakashi squinted his eyes against the instinctive urge to do the same in kind. "I was with my students." "That is quite possibly the worst time you could have possibly chosen." Rather than apologize, Hana cackled. "How fast did you hightail it out of there?" Kakashi pushed away from the wall with a huff and rolled his eyes as he turned towards the kitchen. He couldn't hear her padding after him, but her chakra followed along as he headed toward the tea kettle, filling it with water and setting it on the stove. He's probably not as mad as he's pretending to be. "You realize I can hear your thoughts about me even when you'd rather I not? Am I wrong?" Hana asked cheekily, hopping up onto the counter and hooking him with one ankle to draw him in. Kakashi let himself be settled between her thighs, tilting his head back with a sigh of defeat. "No. You're not wrong. You're not really mad at me." Lifting his head back up and narrowing his eyes, he muttered, "I'm a little irritated." "What could I possibly do to make it up to you?" Hana asked. It wasn't just the knowing grin that told him she already knew what answer he would give. More than that, it was the sudden flood of images that flashed through his mind as she thought about all the myriad things she could do to soothe his battered pride. Kakashi let her think for a few moments in silence until she hit upon a certain idea which spoke to his current mood. "HN. You were thinking about the kitchen floor earlier," he said. Then he laughed when Hana sent him a grin more feral than any of their dogs. Chapter 135, Obito Kakashi, the one where everyone has wings and your colors match your soulmates. Kakashi remembered the way Obito never seemed to care about the way their classmates laughed at him in the academy. No matter how many people teased him and no matter what they were teasing him about, their words always seemed to run off his back like water. He always came back the next day with a smile on his face and a story about some old woman he had helped to cross the road or something. In retrospect, that was something Kakashi admired about him. It was also something he hated about the other boy. How could someone with wings in such terrible shape as his be that happy so often? It almost seemed as though he barely cared for the rare condition which affected him, leaving his feathers in a constant state of rotting molt and hiding his colors from the world. Kakashi had chosen to cover his wings the day his father killed himself, covering them with a deep black dye the same shade as his base color so that he would never know if he had found his soulmate. That was a personal choice, a statement, but poor stupid Obito spent his childhood searching for an other half that he would never be sure if he had found or not. He was there the day Obito met Rin for the first time, lurking on the playground by himself and kicking rocks in irritation that the teachers had forced him to stop training during recess. Watching the older boy puff up his scraggly wings as best he could in the hopes that Rin would respond to him was like watching a wounded animal who didn't even realize it was wounded and was still trying to play. Later he would look back and wish he had paid more attention to how his own appendages had reacted to the display. Kakashi remembered Canopy Bridge a little differently than the story that officially went on record. Rin's capture and rescue, the collapse which crashed his newly discovered friend, and the emergency surgery which replaced the eye he had lost, those things became public knowledge and he didn't care who knew. But the time in between, the few precious moments when he and Obito had been alone in the forest without anyone else around, no one but Kakashi would ever know the truth of those memories. He could remember with perfect clarity the strong voice with which Obito had declared the white-fanged hero, and he could see in his mind's eye the way his wings had flared out, perfectly steady, as bold as anyone with healthy plumage might hold themselves. Facing away at the time, of course the older boy would not have seen the way Kakashi's own wings had responded without thinking. He remembered. Years after, Kakashi would wake in the dead of night, unsure if he should call it a dream or a nightmare, and remember the way it had felt to spread his feathers and present and remain as insane as he had always been. In those few glorious hours he had loved so quickly and so deeply he almost hadn't recognized the feeling for what it was. And then he lost it. And Kakashi would always remember what that felt like too. Kakashi remembered what it felt like to stand in front of a crowd of stoic shinobi and watch Obito's coffin slowly lower into the earth, thinking all the while that it was a terrible place for the boy to find rest considering the circumstances of his death. There wasn't even anything in the coffin to bury, but it still felt like an insult to his memory. Couldn't they at least have honored his spirit by letting him see the sky that his body had been denied in his last moments? Of course, there were other reasons he would never be able to forget that day. Ren's tears had been hot on his skin where she pressed her face into his shoulder. He told himself that he was too tired to ask her to stop, that it would only cause a scene and now was not the time, but they were lies. If he was stronger, he would have wrapped his arms around her and held tightly, would have let a few of his own tears fall into her hair, but he was still weak and so he simply stood there and let her cry. That wasn't it either, though, the reason he would think back to this day so often. No, the moment his memories would return to again and again happened when most of the crowds had dispersed. Several people still lingered in small groups seeking comfort from each other, and yet in that moment the rest of the world slipped away from him as he watched a young woman with distinctive Uchiha features reach into her purse and pull out a single feather. She laid it atop the coffin with red-rimmed eyes that clearly wanted to cry again, though she managed not to. Kakashi walked towards her without feeling the steps, without realizing he was moving, and his eyes never left the feather as he asked her about it. From when he was younger, she told him, the summer after his first year in the academy and the only year his sickness receded enough to allow his feathers to grow in full color. Kakashi lay in bed that night and wondered and wondered and wondered and wondered until the wondering ate at his insides like a creeping poison. He wondered and thought and imagined until finally he gave in. Washing the dye off his wings became easier once he summoned a couple of clones to help. Seeing the colors and knowing he had watched his own soulmate die, nothing could ever make that easier. Kakashi remembered a lot of moments too late, collected his memories to be appreciated after the fact when all was said and done and the importance of those moments had moved on without him. It was a bad habit he never did shake until the biggest moment of his life arrived and Kakashi did the one thing he had regretted not doing in all the ones that came before, he seized it. He didn't need the mask to tell him who the man standing before him was, not now that he had abandoned the cloak of red clouds which had covered certain features before. He would know those wings anywhere. Flaring out his own, Kakashi stood as tall as his habitual slouch would allow and let the orange and silver of his feathers ruffle in the wind, staring hard at the masked man before him. Obito. His voice was strong but his heart was shaking, trembling, breaking even as it healed. Alive, 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 and who cares how? Come home. I am not Obito, I am no one. The break in the other man's voice betrayed him even as his wings did too, rising and spreading to show off the matching bands of color. Kakashi hardly noticed that all movement had stopped around them. Distantly, he registered Naruto's shocked garble of words and something that was probably a guy soothing the boy. He paid little attention to either of them, entirely focused on the one he had lost and found and refused to lose again. You are Obito, my soulmate, and you will come home even if I have to drag your dead lasters back there kicking and screaming. I will take you home. You will stay there. You will be happy. Kakashi paused at the flutter of Obito's wings and smiled. That doesn't sound so bad, does it? I'm not a dead last anymore, was all Obito could say after a long silence. Kakashi would choose to remember that as the moment he won the battle, the war, and Obito's heart. Chapter 136, Tobirama, Naruto, the one where you reincarnate until you meet. In his first life he was alone. Not in the sense that he formed no bonds but in the sense that there was no one else around to form bonds with. Tobirama's first life was that of a nomad, one man alone against the elements with no desire to seek the areas where others of his species had congregated into tribes to build a more stable population. Most would have called it a lonely existence, but he lived his days in perfect contentment, exploring caves and watching new rivers form. He died alone in this life, but it did not sadden him, for he had no way of knowing that there was another out there in the universe waiting to meet him. Tobirama's second life was that of a man with too much power to think. Second born of a powerful clan and blessed with more intelligence than was probably good for him, he spent most of his days seeking various kinds of solitude because it was where he felt most like himself. Science, parchment, and ink were the best friends he made in his second life, and no matter how often his brother waxed poetic about the wonders of soulmates, he never desired anything more. Not to say that he formed no bonds. In this life he had students, family, and eventually an entire village which claimed to love him. Many of his precious people were lucky enough to find their soulmates during this lifetime, but, though it warmed him to see them happy, he felt no drive to seek out the same for himself. Tobirama had been trained to follow his instincts, and what they told him all through this life was that there was no point in searching, not this time. He was therefore content to bide his time until the day he willingly gave his life in protection of the next generation, leaving behind no regrets to weigh him down as he re-entered the cycle of rebirth. It was debatable whether to count his next waking as true a reincarnation. Certainly he was alive in some fashion after having previously died, but it was in the same form as his previous body and still within the same cycle. He couldn't even truly be classified as alive considering his still dead and crumbling body, the yearning of his soul to return to the afterlife, and the fact that he himself had invented the Jutsu which brought him and his brother out of the earth long after they had been buried. Despite both instances of his reanimation being incredibly short, they were also quite eventful, and Tobirama discovered new depths of exasperation for the idiocy of others. He also discovered hope in the form of a young man with golden hair and a smile so bright it rivaled the sun. Naruto was similar to Hashirama in his brilliance, ready to lead even if he hadn't yet figured out where he was going and drawing others in like a lodestone with the power of his words alone. Had they been alive at the same time, Tobirama knew that Naruto was the sort of man he would have followed unquestioningly. He would have complained and provided endless snarky advice, but he would have followed, just as he had for his brother. Unfortunately, he was not alive, not really, and the shining star that was Naruto faded with the rest of the world when the Ida Tensei was released, sending him back to the Pure Lands to await his turn in the great cycle of life. For most of his third life, Tobirama searched. Something inside of him stretched out, reaching for a concept he could barely comprehend. His childhood was spent looking out windows and staring past the borders of their small, forgotten town with a strange kind of wanderlust hidden beneath his ribs. By the time he was old enough to strike out on his own, it was hardly a surprise the day he said farewell to his brother and left home. Someone was waiting for him, he could feel it. Tobirama had heard the old ladies in the market gossiping about soulmates, and some part of him knew that he was out there searching just like he was. He very much intended to find them. It was not to be, however. Good intentions do not always make good deeds, and Tobirama spent the remainder of his third life wandering the farthest corners of the earth he could find until he was too old to go on. Only at the end of his days did he stop and wonder why it never occurred to him to go home again. Regret, he discovered, was heavy enough to weigh a man down into the grave. Tobirama's fourth and fifth lives were short, unremarkable. One ended before he ever left the womb, and the other saw the worst of a sickness that leveled several communities. He never grew old enough to wonder about the pulling in his heart. In his sixth life, Tobirama was 8 years old when he woke one morning and thought to himself that he was needed. Morning had barely crested the horizon and frost nicked at the grass covering his front yard, but Tobirama put on his boots anyway and tottered out the front door without waking anyone else in the house. His steps were sure and purposeful as he marched his way down the street, ignoring the young man out for a morning jog who eyed him strangely, as well as the woman walking her dog who asked if he was lost. His legs were tired by the time he felt like he was getting close. If he'd brought his brother along, Hashirama would have said they had been walking forever and ever, but Tobirama, ever the more practical even at this young age, thought it was probably closer to an hour or so. Still, it was a relief to turn off the road when that strange feeling inside of him told him to. The house he had arrived at was a quaint little two-story building with a brand new swing set in the front yard, shiny and perfect atop the perfectly manicured lawn. Tobirama struggled his way up the icy front steps and used both hands to pull at the doorknob, rattling it back and forth until giving in to the inevitability that it was locked. Then he thumped impatiently on the door in a continuous barrage. Hopefully the people inside were awake, because he didn't think he had the patience to wait for very long. Luckily the door cracked open after only a couple of minutes to reveal a sleek man with messy yellow hair and half-lidded blue eyes who smelled faintly of hospital chemicals. Tobirama blinked at him once before wordlessly squirming through his legs into the home. "Whoa, hey, what?" The man spun around in surprise, but Tobirama was already past him and heading for the stairs. "Hold on just a minute, who are you?" "I have to go this way now," Tobirama told him imperiously, taking off down the upper hallway. The man scrambled after him, but his heart was clambering inside his chest, bells and alarms going off inside his head as if to say, you're here, you've arrived." A second voice joined in the shouting as he burst through one of several identical doors and found himself inside a nursery with garish orange decor and a shiny new crib against the far wall. "Get away from my son," a woman's voice roared from behind him. Fingers brushed the collar of his shirt as he darted forward, but then the man's voice interrupted the woman, shushing her in a soothing tone. "Wait. Kushina, wait. Watch." Tobirama was grateful for the sudden silence as he peeked in through the bars of the crib with wide, curious eyes. Strange. He wondered why he'd had such a strong urge to find his way here to see this particular baby, this family he'd never met before. Sparse tufts of golden hair covered the baby's head, drawing his fingers forward to check if they felt as soft as they looked. Tobirama knew why he had come here the moment he touched the child. 8, he murmured. He lived 8 times, I only lived 6 times. I thought I would be older. It took a bit of effort to ignore the sudden exclamations of happy surprise and realization from the pair behind him, but Tobirama had a lot of practice ignoring his older brother, so it wasn't too hard. Still with his hand between the bars of the crib, Tobirama stroked the baby's hair and graced the small form with a smile. "Hello, Naruto. I'm sorry that you've been waiting for me. Now it's my turn to wait for you. Grow up quickly, please." Chapter 137, Minato Kakashi, the one where you meet in your dreams. Minato was a smart boy, all of his teachers said so. He was barely more than 5 when they bestowed him the title of genius, and it wasn't long afterwards that he began to ask questions about what dreaming meant. Lots of people talked about meeting others in the dreams all the time, and Minato wasn't sure what they were referring to. How can you meet someone while you're asleep? He listened to their explanation without understanding exactly what they were talking about, but one thing he did understand: it was strange that he didn't have dreams of his own. He was 10 years old and the subject of much teasing by the time Minato fell asleep, only to wake up in a world unlike anything he had ever seen. Everything as far as the eye could see glittered with fantastical colors and shapes, the air was the perfect temperature, and he felt the strangest sense of belonging, peace. It took a moment for him to look down and see the newborn baby sitting in a comfortable-looking bassinet right next to him. The baby, to his relief, did nothing but sit quietly. Minato spent the night exploring, and when he woke up again he was back in his own bed at home, just like breaking a genjutsu. His parents were thrilled to hear about his first dream, and that was when Minato finally understood what had happened. The baby was his soulmate, born at last a full 10 years after him. Age gaps went uncommon, although their difference of a full decade was definitely on the upper ranges of a normal, but Minato could not have cared less. When he woke in their own personal dreamscape the next night, he spent his hours there cradling the child in his lap and whispering all of his dreams for the future. It was nice to have someone to share his most secret thoughts with, someone who wouldn't judge or offer opinions. He told the babe everything he hoped they could be to each other, and smiled because his soulmate would never be alone the way he had been. Days turned into weeks and then, of course, into months. Minato woke every morning with a smile on his face after spending his dreams playing with the cutest baby that would ever exist. There was no way for him to know the child's name until he grew old enough to say so himself, but Minato was patient. Not having a name did not change the love he could already feel growing inside him. It was still a massive surprise to sit down at the dando shop one day, look over, and see someone he had until now only known in the world of dreams. "He won't take his bottle," the woman holding his soulmate said worriedly. "Is he sick? We should take him to the doctor. I won't let my baby starve." The man across the table from her, the white fang, chuckled and patted her on the wrist. "Maybe he just isn't hungry, dear. Babies are always hungry. They get full too. Let the pup tell you when he needs something." Although she clearly wasn't any less worried, the woman subsided and began to play with the tuft of silver hair atop her son's head. Minato clapped his teeth down around a streak of possessiveness that wanted to tell her he was the only one who got to do that. Rising from his chair, he stumbled his way across the little shop and ignored the concerned voice of Jirai-sensei asking where he was going. "Excuse me." Minato licked his lips nervously when the white fan himself turned to smile curiously at him. What's his name?" "He's a cute little pup, isn't he? His name is Kakashi. Take Kakashi. Can I hold him?" Minato jumped in surprise when his questing fingers were gently slapped away and Kakashi's mother gathered him protectively to her chest, eyeing him suspiciously as though he meant some sort of harm. Even more oddly, the white fan did nothing but chuckle again. "You like babies, huh?" he asked. Monado couldn't get his eyes to leave the baby's face. "He's my soulmate. I hold him all the time. I just wanted your soulmate." The woman's arms loosened and Monado leaned forward, happy to see Kakashi squirming around to look back at him. "Please. Can I please hold him?" He wasn't sure how effective it was going to be, but he'd seen Jiraiya-sensei get his way with woman a lot by making his eyes go really wide and sticking out his bottom lip. Monado tried it now, adding a little wobble to his chin in a fit of inspiration. Amazingly, it actually did work. He could see the woman's resolve crumbling almost immediately. The moment Kakashi settled into his arms, Monado was struck by how very right it felt. Somehow it was different being together here in the real world rather than in their shared dreamscape. It was probably a failsafe to keep soulmates from attempting to spend forever in the dreams, but the why of it didn't matter at the moment, not when baby Kakashi was smiling and waving one chubby arm up to reach for him. Monado laughed in delight when sticky fingers began to pull on his hair. "Hello Kakashi," he murmured. "It's nice to finally meet you. For real, I mean." "Well, isn't that something?" the white fan said. Monado barely heard him. He was more focused on the precious being in his arms. "I'm going to protect you and love you forever. You'll always be my most important person." He had never meant any words more strongly. Whatever life had to throw at them in the future, Monado was sure that he would make it through as long as he had Kakashi to come back to. Chapter 138, Madara Monado, the one where you have a random sentence they will say on your own. When they first met, the world was still a little unsteady. Neither one of them expected to walk out of the Pure Lands, especially not after having been sent back after previous reanimations. Madara especially found the experience a little jarring. He had more than been reanimated, he had been fully resurrected and then found his death for the second time. It felt as though only moments had passed before he found himself quite alive again, bare feet against warm soil and blinking under the harsh sunlight above him. Others stood in loose groups around the same barren landscape, yet none of them seemed to know why they were alive once more. It was there he first met Monado. Considering his actions in his short-lived second life, Madara could admit that punching him in the face upon first sight was a perfectly understandable reaction. He didn't like it, but it had been a good many decades since he had liked anything other than the thought of his final rest. Even the infinite Tsukiyomi had lost its shine after so many years of chasing, his mind driven along its chosen path out of little more than a sense of duty. He owed it to the brothers he had lost to build the perfect world he'd promised over their graves. Having lived twice already, Madara found that he cared very little for what happened to him now. He barely glanced at the shinobi who captured him, gave no protest when he was transferred to Konoha's prisons, and spent several years in the darkness without questioning his future. It could have been 1 year or 10, and he would not have noticed that time had passed if not for the man with the golden hair. Monado, one of the guards, called him, though Madara recognized him only as one of the faces who had been reincarnated during the war, the face of the man who had dared to punch Uchiha Madara in the face at first sight. His sudden reappearance and the heat in his eyes as he glared through the bars of the cell door drew stirrings of interest in Madara for the first time since he found himself brought back to this empty world. "We are going to make an example out of you," the man had said, and Madara had rightfully believed he was about to be executed. The thought was neither a good one nor a bad one, merely a simple statement that meant about as much to him as an observation on the current weather. Life had very little meaning the third time around. As it turned out, however, death was not the example he was expected to provide. After being granted the luxury of a hot shower and clean clothing, a good meal and a hearty cone, Madara was given into the care of the man with golden hair and trotted through the streets of Konoha at least once a day so that all who wished to see him could do so. What they saw was the mastermind behind all of the world's troubles tamed and leashed, taking heart from their triumph over his evil. Madara had no wish to disabuse them of their misconceptions. Without the chakra seals hidden beneath the wide neck of his robes, he was still powerful enough to level the village with little more than a thought. But what would be the point? He had come close to such dreams of destruction once before and discovered them to be hollow. There was little amusement to be found in going down that path again. He did find plenty of amusement in the care of Monado, much to his surprise. It felt like waking up slowly, day by day, as though he was still returning to life, but each day he spent with the other man made him feel more and more present in a way he hadn't felt since stumbling out of the Pure Lands. Minato was bright and kind, and he reminded Madara almost painfully of Hashirama and the friendship he had so carelessly thrown away. Naruto inspires forgiveness in everyone around him, he said when Madara dared to ask why the man had agreed to house a monster such as himself. I can only hope to someday be as good of a person as my son. He is too loud, Madara countered. His warden only laughed. Yes, well, he gets that from his mother. After thinking that over for a moment, Madara asked, do you miss her? It was an honest question, her interest he was surprised to feel, and he'd never bothered to take other people's feelings into account before when sating his own curiosities. When Minato's expression flattened and he turned away without answering, Madara understood that he had overstepped what little boundaries he was allowed. Strangely enough, he felt remorse for his words. The novelty of it was enough to distract him until Minato deigned to speak with him again several hours later. Later, he would hear the story of Uzumaki Kushina's death during Obito's attack on the village in his name, when his young protégé pulled the kyuubi from its container as Madara had taught him to. Guilt tasted like iron, he discovered, or perhaps that was the blood in his mouth from biting down on his tongue. Knowing how much he had taken from the man, how many years and loved ones he had stolen even if not directly by his own hand, Madara was both impressed and honored by Minato's capacity to forgive. For each transgression he was granted clemency, he found himself working harder to earn the other man's good favor. He couldn't remember a time in his life when he had ever cared for the opinion of another, but there was something special about Minato he could not describe, something inexpressible which made him feel both very small and very big at the same time. It was a surprisingly addictive feeling. For 3 years the two of them lived in relative peace, falling into patterns which grew all too comfortable. Madara wondered often whether that example he made had a time limit, if he was to parade through the streets every day for the rest of his life, or if he was to be disposed of once his purpose had been served, but he dared not ask. Though it took a very long time to admit it, Madara had no desire to leave Minato's side. He enjoyed his place in the cramped bedroom at the back of the man's home, he enjoyed the time he was allowed out to walk at Minato's side through the streets where he largely ignored the staring citizens, and most of all he enjoyed the conversations he was able to drag the man into when he was brought his meals. It was not a glamorous existence, yet he found himself content in a way he never had been in his first life. The fact that he had fallen in love at some point probably had a great deal to do with that. It was the quiet sort of devotion he never would have expected from himself. Uchiha tended to be quite open and brash with their affections. His situation was quite unique, and he was more aware that there were little chance Minato could ever return his ardor, yet he was oddly content to sit idly by and laugh from what little distance he was allowed. To have any part of Minato was enough, even the small parts allotted to a reformed and humbled criminal. There were also the words printed on the man's arm, a ridiculously dramatic statement which did not sound like anything he would ever say. Minato's sole words would have given him pause even if he was stupid enough to reach beyond his station. Surely they would have been spoken by the woman to whom Minato had devoted his previous life, to the one who died at his side in defense of their only son. Soul marks were another subject Madara had learned to avoid asking about, lest he overstep his boundaries again and cause both of them more pain. He had never had the chance to meet his own soulmate, but Madara imagined that losing them would be a pain unlike any other. Even the monsters in the closet like him made mistakes, however. Madara had no intention of ever bringing up the subject of soulmates, had done very well keeping his mouth shut and admiring from afar, and it was all ruined the day someone attacked him on the daily march through the public streets. Just as he had been unable to blame Minato for punching him on first sight, Madara could not bring himself to be angry at the woman who lunged at him as they passed through the marketplace. Her curry headband meant nothing to him, but the rage and grief in her eyes were all too familiar, the kind of lust that festers and grows like a cancer. Even after Minato had pulled her off him and hurried them away towards home, Madara could still see her eyes as though she were right there in front of him. He had worn those eyes himself for far too many years. If he had been able to concentrate properly, he might have worked himself up into a mood because of the incident. Luckily, in at least that respect, the woman's attack had sent his head careening into the pavement and left him with a slight concussion. He was blessedly unable to concentrate enough to dwell on darker subjects. "Are you sure you won't agree to see a medic?" Minato asked as they hobbled into the cramped bedroom at the back of the house. Madara huffed. "No need," he insisted. It's nothing to be so excited about. They both knew Monado could force him to see a healer, that it was within his rights to make decisions about his ward's health, but they both knew that he wouldn't do that. Madara wasn't sure if it was ingrained politeness or if the other man truly had grown some respect for him, though he told himself it was the latter as he spilled down onto his mattress with very little grace. A wry smile touched his face when Monado's arm appeared to steady him, but before he could say anything else his gaze caught upon the familiar letters he had seen on display several times before. "It's a shame it's so random," he said. "What?" Monado held him a little tighter as he swayed sideways, trying to tilt his head. "If it were first words then you would know them right away, but of course it must be more difficult than that. A random sentence that your soulmate will speak at an undetermined point in time." He shook his head, stopping when it made the room spin, then refocused on the arm holding him up. "You are the center around which my universe orbits." Honestly, how did she manage to work that into conversation? A heavy silence followed his words, drawing his attention upwards to where Monado was staring at him with wide eyes filled with shock. It took a moment before he realized what he had done and cringed. "My apologies. I did not mean to remind you of your lust, mate." But that's a..." Confused by his warden's jumbled non-answer, Madara furrowed his brows but did not press the issue. He had apologized for his indiscretion. Any further comments were just as likely to do more damage to the situation as they were to help him crawl back out of it, especially with his head feeling strange from the concussion. His mind wandered a little and his eyelids began to droop tiredly, but he was jolted back to awareness when Monado let out an explosive sigh. "I can't believe it. You don't even realize." "No, of course you wouldn't, not if you assume." "Huh?" Madara looked up at the man with half-lidded eyes. "Kushina was not my soulmate. She was my wife and I loved her very much, but she never spoke the words on my arm, not in all the years we spent together. Nor did I speak her words." Monado paused to take a deep breath in and let it back out slowly. "But you just spoke my words. And I felt you speak them. I don't understand." Licking at his lips with obvious nerves, Monado looked away for a moment to gather his thoughts. Madara was glad because the quick flash of a pink tongue had caught his eye and he very nearly lost all sense of self-control at the sight of it. "You're my soulmate." Those words most certainly brought his attention back to the conversation at hand. "I beg your pardon." Madara wondered if the sensation of the world tilting on its side was due to the concussion or the incredible words he suspected he may have just misheard. That sounded very much like he just said we are soulmates. Monado nodded silently. Oh. There wasn't much more to say. It was unexpected news for sure, but even the pain and dizziness of his injury couldn't distract him from the knowledge that this may not be the ideal situation to his apparent other half. Bound they might be, but the universe did allow the element of choice. If Monado did not want him, there was very little Madara could do about that beyond sit quietly and continue to love from afar. Trying not to be too obvious about his movements, Madara brushed a few fingers over his sleeve where the words he had been born with were hidden just underneath. What would it feel like to have Monado speak these words, he wondered. There were 100 different ways they could be interpreted, so he knew better than to get his hopes up, but that did not stop his imagination from immediately providing several happy endings, each more unlikely than the last. Monado cleared his throat awkwardly and Madara winced. If he had built the perfect world as he had planned, would Monado have been in it? He could hardly imagine happiness without the man now. Still, he knew what the proper thing to do was in this situation he had made for himself. "Would you like for me to go? I am sure your Hokage would be willing to find me another warden or return me to the prisons as needed." "No. And no, I don't do that. I want you to stay." Fire licked underneath his skin. "I want you to stay," burnt deep in black letters and seared into his memory to preserve this moment even without the use of his Sharingan. Madara gasped at the sensation of it. He trembled under the weight of such heavy words even as his heart lifted. Monado wanted him to stay. "Were those your words?" "Yes," he breathed, still shaken. Monado gave a nervous tittering laugh. "That's rare, for both of us to speak each other's words so close together. Wow. I wasn't expecting any of this." Madara raised his head, but as soon as their eyes met he dropped it again, knowing it would be all too obvious on his face that he had dreamed of this, desperately wished for it and yet never dared to hope. It took warm fingers tucking under his chin to lift it back up, but he hardly had a chance to say anything about it. They were kissing. Soft pressure against his lips, careful fingers caressing his jaw, lingering heat dancing under the skin of his arm, all of it working together to overwhelm him in the best way possible. Madara squeezed his eyes shut tighter and prayed for this moment to last forever, or at least that he might have a chance to prove the truth of the words he had spoken. Monado was the brilliant sun around which his darkened, awakening galaxy expanded, the center around which his universe revolved. It had taken 3 lifetimes, but finally he understood the joy of basking in another's light. Chapter 139, Izuna Didama, the one where you feel each other's pain. Are you sure about this, Hachiro? Izuna checked their surroundings for perhaps the 5th time in 5 minutes. Shouldn't we find somewhere that isn't so out in the open? What if he screams and draws attention from a passing patrol or something? You asked too many questions. Grunting with relief, his patrol companion dropped to one knee and let the body he'd been carrying fall to one side. Hachiro was his 3rd cousin twice removed or something like that, a distant relative of a relative, and they'd never gotten along well to begin with. Izuna wished it had been almost anyone else with him while he ran patrols today. Coming across a lone Senju they could overpower and take prisoner would have been a stroke of luck on any other day. Izuna would have brought them back to his father if he let them live at all. Hachiro, on the other hand, he was the cruel sort. As soon as he rendered the Senju unconscious, he made it very clear that he intended to have a little playtime. Torture wasn't exactly Izuna's record in the first place, but he was always particularly grossed out by how much Hachiro enjoyed it whenever someone let him run loose. Still, Hachiro was older and just that little bit stronger that Izuna had resigned himself to waiting this out. A live Senju was a rare capture. A member of the head family. Not even Hachiro would be stupid enough to kill the kid, not when he knew Izuna would tell his father about it later. He is fine. Hachiro slapped his hands together once and grinned. Time to have a little fun. You helping? No. I think I'll just, watch from over there. The grin his distant cousin sent him was off-putting, and Izuna looked away quickly, dropping down at the base of a nearby tree. He wasn't normally much given to sympathy where his enemies were concerned, but there was something about the boy they had caught that he couldn't get out of his head. Maybe it was the fact that they were so close in age. Or maybe it was the cute face, two-toned hair falling in front of big doe eyes and cheeks that still held lingering traces of baby fat even though he was well into his adolescence. A part of Izuna, the part that remembered being an older brother, wanted to ask what this kid was doing out in the forest alone. He showed up on the battlefield sometimes and he wasn't half bad, but usually Izuna marked him holding back with the other medics to patch up the wounded and send them back out to fight. The Uchiha made a point of never sending anyone with medic training out alone. Maybe it was different in the Senju clan, but to the Uchiha medics were considered a precious commodity. Even if he wasn't watching, and he certainly didn't care for this kid personally, he still winced at the sound of a harsh slap, quickly followed by a gasp. Wakey wakey, Hachiro's voice snickered. Hello little Senju. Are you ready to have a little fun? Oh fuck. Izuna blinked in surprise and spun his head around to stare. The kid was almost as old as him, certainly old enough to swear, but for whatever reason he'd seemed like the innocent type. On second thought, that was a stupid assumption, though. No shinobi was ever innocent. Maybe later, Hachiro said. The boy gagged. Gross, no way, no thank you. You're really not my type. Big brown eyes flickered over to where Izuna was slumped and then darted away again. All eyes were drawn to Hachiro instead when he gave an ugly laugh. I'm about to be your whole world. Rather than look frightened, the boy raised one eyebrow when Hachiro pulled out a kunai. It made him look disturbingly similar to his brother Tobirama for a moment until he raised the other to match and began to blink owlishly. Amazingly, it actually seemed to give his attacker pause for a few moments, and Izuna nearly laughed out loud when he realized the kid was actually using those eyes of his to garner sympathy, weaponized cuteness. With a face like that, he could imagine it worked on a lot of people. Unfortunately, it wasn't bound to work for long on someone like Hachiro. Wide eyes narrowed into an expression of irritation when a sharp point of steel pressed against the boy's neck, tracing senseless patterns against his skin. Either he was too brave to feel afraid of what was obviously about to happen, or he somehow didn't understand how serious the situation really was. Or maybe he thought some kind of miracle would still save him, although Izuna hoped he wasn't holding his breath for that. "Do you want to hear how I'm about to kill you?" Hachiro asked, turning his grin toward Izuna. "Or would you like me to keep it as a surprise?" "I do like surprises," the boy chirped. "However you like it." With a dark chuckle, Hachiro dragged the knife down until it was pressed against the front of one shoulder and pushed inwards until the skin broke and blood began to pour from the wound. The boy didn't so much as flinch. Izuna did. A quiet gasp slipped past his control when his own shoulder exploded with unexpected pain. Convulsing once, he clapped a hand over the area to confirm there was no blood, nothing there that should be hurting him. He grunted in surprise when pain flared on the opposite shoulder and looked up to find that Hachiro had cut into the boy's flesh in exactly the same spot. His distant cousin was also grinning at him again with a strange light in his eyes, almost as if he could sense Izuna's pain and was enjoying it. There was no hint of surprise or curiosity on his face, but he did look gleeful. It was the same look he had whenever he caught small animals in the traps he set up around their Klein compound, the poor helpless things he liked to torture and maim until either they died or he grew bored. Izuna had put more than one rabbit out of its misery after Hachiro was through with them. "So I was right," he said. Izuna blinked. "Right?" Hachiro drew the kunai out of their prisoner's shoulder and drove the butt of it into the boy's temple. At the moment of impact, pain blossomed in Izuna's head and he staggered sideways, ears ringing. An impossible idea occurred to him, but it wasn't until his cousin began to laugh that it really took shape. Hachiro beat him to the punch with a cackling laugh. "You're always so busy with that albino demon, you're stupid Senju rival. He blinds you to the rest of the battlefield. But I see the way this pretty little thing flinches every time you get hurt, tapped away from the fighting like the weak one he is. Your soulmate." Standing upright, he dragged the knife across his tongue and savored the taste of the blood. "I've always wanted to play with a pair of soulmates." But Hachiro." Izuna blinked furiously as he tried to clear away the dizziness. "This is going to be so much fun, isn't it? I've wanted to get rid of you for a long time, Izuna. And now I have a chance to make it really satisfying." "You freak," Izuna whispered. Hachiro laughed and reached out towards their Senju captive, holding him by the jaw so tightly that Izuna could feel his own bones creaking in protest. His instinct told him to struggle even as his conscious mind understood that there was nothing to struggle against. The smile dripping from Hachiro's lips like acid didn't change as he spun the kunai around again to press its point against the boy's jugular vein. He snickered, watching Izuna freeze in place, a quiet hiccuping noise that grew louder and louder until it could only be described as a mad cackle, never moving his eyes from his distant cousin. They both knew he held all the power in his hands at the moment, and it was clear how much of a rush that gave him. If Izuna moved, Hachiro would hurt him. If he didn't move, Hachiro would still hurt him. Caught between a rock and a hard place didn't quite cover the situation enough. Watching each other as they were, neither of them saw the Senju moving until it was much too late for Hachiro anyway. Izuna just barely caught movement in the corner of his eye before the blade had changed hands. The Senju was up on his feet, and Hachiro was gurgling around the blood and steel choking his throat. His fingers twitched, grasping weakly at the arm, pressing his own weapon into him, but it did nothing to deter the kind of justice Izuna had only heard of in fairy tales. It could only be called fair that Hachiro die at the hands of the one he'd been trying to kill. He wasn't quite dead yet when he slid off the blade, but the moment his body hit the ground with a muffled thump, he might as well have been for all the attention Izuna or the Senju paid him. Neither of them bothered to watch him draw his last breaths, one uninterested in his own would-be killer and the other eager to forget the relative who clearly intended to torture him through a newly discovered soul bond. They busied themselves instead with watching each other. Izuna clenched his fists against the echo of burning pain in both of his shoulders until, to his great surprise, the boy graced him with a wide smile. "Sorry about you, friend, but I wasn't really looking to die today. Toby's gonna worry if I don't make it home soon, and I don't like making him worry. He gets really overbearing." He turned as if to leave, and Izuna leapt forward. "Wait. You can't just go. We have you, might please just tell me your name." "My name is Idama." Honestly, I'm freaking out that we are soulmates, but I thought I could play it cool until you were out of sight. Idama rubbed at the back of his head nervously. My shoulders hurt and my soulmate is an Uchiha. This day is crazy. I just wanted more hobes because there's a flu going around the kids, but then you guys surprised me and I just really want to go home and process it all. Idama. The name tasted light on his tongue, like a foreign fruit with an exotic flavor, and it made him shiver. Across the clearing he could see Idama shiver as well before licking his lips anxiously and pressing a hand to one of his dripping wounds. The once soft green of his shirt was slowly turning red with blood dripping down his chest. I have to go home. Will you meet me again? Just the thought of his soulmate slipping away from him was almost more painful than feeling the sensation of Idama's skin shredding apart and echoing in his own body. He waited impatiently while the other boy thought it over, chewing his bottom lip to stop himself from blurting out anything else to interrupt such important thoughts. Finally Idama grinned, a beautiful smile for a beautiful face, and came towards him with confident steps. Izuna swallowed against a burst of nerves but held his ground as that smile came closer, surprisingly distracting with straight white teeth and full lips. Then Idama was there pressing those lips against his own and Izuna groaned before he could stop himself. He wanted to say it felt like fireworks, but instead it was like the world fell away and left them both in perfect nothingness, oblivious to anything but the young man before him and the wet fingers that traced the shape of his jaw. And then it was over and Idama was skipping back across the clearing with one hand pressed to his shoulder with the glow of healing chakra wrapped around his palm. Tell you what, he was saying. I'd love to have a soulmate, especially one that kisses that good, but it's like I said before, I'm not really looking to die. We can meet again when there is peace between our clans and I don't have to be afraid that your big brother and my big brothers will try to rip each other's faces off over this. What? I can't make peace by myself, you know. You can put in a good word. Idama laughed and turned away. Hold on, damn it. Get back here. For a second he thought Idama really was going to stay, but he was only throwing one last smile over his shoulder along with a parting shot. Oh, and teach your clan mates to tie better knots. I was free in what, 5 minutes? A moment later he was gone, leaping into the trees and heading east. Izuna watched him go with exasperation heavy in his chest and his fingers pressed gently to his lips. As much as he hated to say so of any Senju, he really would like to get to know this guy more. If peace was the only way to do that, then, dare he even think it, Izuna thought he might be willing to actually go through with it. To do that, however, he would need to convince Madara. As he stared in the direction his soulmate had disappeared, Izuna wondered how hard it would be to rekindle his brother's childhood dreams of peace with the Senju clan. Chapter 140, Gaara Naruto, the one where marks on your soulmate's body show up on your own. Guess who? A smile twitched at the corners of his mouth as Gaara slowly came awake, as surprised as he always was that he had managed to fall asleep at all. One breath brushed against the nape of his neck and a solid weight shifted against his back, the only two clues he needed to know who was behind him, but Gaara turned his head with a curious hum and played along anyway. Who's there? He rumbled in a voice heavy with sleep. It's me. Naruto whined indignantly. Nobody else better be crawling into your bed at 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm the only one allowed in here. Of course not, Naruto. Hands grasped at his shoulder and Gaara offered no resistance when they pulled gently, rolling him onto his back. He was rewarded for his compliance by nearly 6 feet of enthusiastic blonde settling over his hips to grin down at him like his own personal sunshine. Naruto was attractive at the best of times, but he was especially beautiful haloed by the sooner sunrise, already brilliant hair turned golden by the rays filtering in through the window just behind him. Gaara lifted one hand to trace the love kanji drawn on the other man's forehead, an echo of the mark he had given himself as a child when he'd thought the only person he would ever love was himself. What he wouldn't give to go back in time and tell his younger self how mistaken he was. Nothing could have prepared him for the way Naruto filled his heart, his thoughts, his days and nights, for the ways he would be changed by such unwavering affection. From the moment they met, his soulmate's love had been steadfast, honest and freely given. It made him strive to be a better person who deserved that kind of love. Fingers closing around his wrist snapped him out of his reflective thoughts, bringing him back to the present when Naruto was staring down at him with slight concern. Gaara offered him a reassuring smile and worked his hand free so that he could move on to tracing the whisker marks he loved so much. He hadn't always loved them, of course. For most of his childhood he'd thought they belonged to himself, present as they were right out of the womb. It wasn't until he found Naruto and marveled over their matching scars that he heard the story of how these markings came to be, how they originated from his other half rather than himself. No other shared mark between them was more precious to him now. "Are you all right?" Naruto asked. Gaara ignored his question for a moment. "Have I ever told you how grateful I am that you mastered your father's Hiraishin jutsu?" Yeah. Now I can visit you whenever I want without talking a bunch of days off from being Hokage." Naruto's concern melted away to become a brilliant smile as easily as that, and Gaara took a moment to soak in the warmth that swept through him at the sight of it. "I appreciate your visits," he said. "Though I do wish I could visit you more often myself. Konoha is your home and I do feel bad that you always have to come here to me." Naruto sniffed as though he'd said something incredibly offensive, nose in the air and arms crossing petulantly across his chest. "Well, I like coming here to visit you, so there. I'll come visit you anywhere even if you go to the whole other side of the world, Tebaya. I love you." "Ah. I love you too, Naruto." "Aha." His soulmate deflated and scratched at his whiskers sheepishly. "That's good. But I was sleeping before you arrived and woke me up quite comfortably, in fact. There is still some time before I need to be up. Would you lie next to me for a bit?" As much as he appreciated any and all time they were able to spend together, his sleeping habits still hadn't fully recovered from the years he had spent awake trying to keep Shikaku at bay. Sleep was a precious commodity for the fifth Kazekage. As he should have expected, his question elicited watery eyes and frantic nodding, Naruto dropping his weight off to one side so he could curl in behind Gaara and press up against his back again. For a moment he lifted his head to eye the open curtains across the room, but Gaara only hummed and drew the blankets up a little further, content in the cocoon of warmth he suddenly found himself in. He really did enjoy all the time that Naruto was able to steal away so they could be together. Sometimes all he wanted to do with that time was to lay together in the comfort of a soft bed and enjoy the strong arms around him, counting all the scars there that echoed on his own skin just the same. Naruto snuffled into his hair and Gaara smiled one more time before peace washed over him and he drifted comfortably back to sleep. Chapter 141, Minada, the one with the red string of fate. "Explain it to me again," Tobirama murmured from where he was walking just a little too close to Minado's heels. It would have been annoying if the man's enthusiasm for learning weren't so stupidly adorable. "It's a time-space splinter." Minado smiled. "I exist here in your era, but I also exist in the era I was born in. My theory is that when I fell through the crack, for lack of a better word, I split time in two and created an alternate reality. A new timeline, if you will. The other timeline is still intact and continuing on just as things were meant to, but this one, us right now, my presence here will change this timeline." He peeked over his shoulder to see Tobirama hanging on his every word, much like Kakashi used to listen to him when he was describing a new jutsu. "Fascinating," the other man rumbled. Minado stopped for a moment to look around to take his bearings. He wasn't quite as good a sensor as his companion, but he was fair at it, enough to know that there were several bodies to the east and one to the north, the flickering flame of a man close to death. "If you do not mind me asking more questions, what led you to believe that the timelines are separate? How can you be sure that your original world is still intact? How do you know your presence here has changed things? You ask better questions than my students used to. At least you're not asking about the maximum number of heads you can sever in under a minute." Minada laughed until he saw the confusion in Tobirama's eyes and cleared his throat before pressing on. "It's hard to explain, but I can feel my alternate self. I know that he exists, and I will know when he dies. As for changes, I lost my red string when I was 8 years old and I found the other end of it. Yet when I found myself in this time there, it was again tied to my left pinky and I felt a strange disconnection with the memory of my wife." Silence fell, for which he was grateful. Minado still wasn't sure how he felt about the situation with Kushina. Since the day he met her, he had loved her with his entire being. Now he found himself nearly 100 years in the past, but the memory of her held no particular feeling of warmth, no draw. After so many years together, he thought he should at least think of her fondly, and the fact that he didn't was the source of a strange kind of guilt. The string around his pinky was the reason the two of them were out in the forest right now, wandering in whichever direction his fate line saw fit to lead him. Although he considered himself a man of Konoha, Minato had sworn no allegiance to Hashirama in particular. He felt no guilt in leaving the village on his own terms to seek out his own agendas. Tobirama had followed because the man had more questions than he knew what to do with the regular state for him, it seemed, and he could be back at the village in an instant if he needed to be. 100 yards further of quiet ambling passed before Tobirama hummed and thought. I don't suppose. You are not doing experiments on my fate line. But. No, Minato shook his head firmly and allowed his companion the dignity of not watching him pout like a child denied his favorite toy. A tug on the little finger of his left hand distracted him, pausing his steps as he lifted his head to look east. He couldn't sense any chakra coming from that direction, but that wasn't too disconcerting. Most high-level shinobi were fairly skilled at concealing their presence. Knowing that he was close, Minato stepped a little more carefully and turned his feet to where he was being led. It still took a while before they actually got anywhere. His red string danced through the morning dew in several bushes, went circles around a number of trees, looped around a sunny clearing and then plunged into the mouth of a dark cave that seemed to spring up as if from nowhere. One moment Minato was tripping on a root and then the next he thought the sun had spontaneously disappeared. He blinking around at the sudden darkness, looking over at Tobirama to see the same reaction, then tugged curiously at his fate line. Almost immediately he felt a responding tug as though whoever was on the other end of it was trying to call him forward. He was very happy to answer that call. The cave went deep underground, so deep they had to stop for a few moments for Tobirama to light a candle so they could see where they were going. Something about this darkened tunnel tugged at him in the way his alternate self did. Was this place destined to be important to him no matter what timeline he lived in? It was a strange concept, but he entertained himself as he walked by turning over the possibilities of it in his mind. When the two of them finally stumbled out of the hallway into a mid-sized cavern, Minato was first distracted by the sharp breath his companion sucked in and then startled by the war cry as Tobirama rushed past him. Only then did he notice the other figure they had just discovered. Long tangles of ink-black hair and eyes that burned with the familiar tomo of a Sharingan, obviously this was an Uchiha they had discovered. Minato rather carefully set aside the fact that he immediately found this man to be incredibly attractive. He set his focus on the fact that he also seemed oddly familiar and that clearly Tobirama knew him, judging by the fact that both of them were howling and swinging fists at each other like offended cats. Minato wondered if either of them even remembered they had various weaponry strapped to their backs. I take it you've met before, he murmured unnecessarily. You abandoned your own dreams, Madara. Tobirama snarled, throwing another punch. You broke my brother's heart. Madara, and that explained why he felt so familiar, although he still looked different from the hand-drawn portraits in the Academy's history books, almost choked himself trying to snort contemptuously and tilt his head back for a laugh at the same time. I told that idiot I was leaving before I did. Not my fault if he wants to mope about it. Go scurry back to lick your brother's boots, Senju. I've been perfectly peaceful since I left, and that's mainly because I don't have to look at you every day. He sneered dismissively in a manner which riveted Minato to the spot, doubly so when the man turned to spot him where he was still hovering in the entrance. Who else is here with you? Tobirama demanded before Madara could say anything. No one. Impossible. There must be someone else here. Minato is a good man. I refuse to believe he could be matched to someone as dour as you. His words gave the other man pause. Matched? He looked down at the string tied around his finger in a neat little bow, and, for the first time since he had entered the cavern, Minato looked down at his own. The string was pulled taut, running unerringly from his hand to Madara's. Having lived the beginning of one life already and found his soulmate in that world, Minato knew exactly what that meant, knew exactly what one was meant to do in this situation. He was held back by the distrusting look on the other man's face and by the shock that his soulmate in this timeline was none other than Uchiha Madara himself. Clearly he wasn't the only one immobilized by shock, but Madara, at least, managed to recover quickly. My intended, the man breathed, entirely forgetting the one who had just been attacking him in favor of stumbling across the uneven floor in the direction his fate line was leading him. The brilliant red string grew shorter and shorter the closer they got until they were standing toe-to-toe. Minato offered a smile. Ah, hello. My name is Minato. It's nice to meet you. Shall we? He held up his left hand, chuckling lightly when Madara only tilted his head in confusion. Like this. He would have been smugly amused by the ghast Madara let out to make a legendary titan such as in Ghast should have had his chest puffed out with pride, but his attention was taken up entirely by the way their fingers slid together so perfectly, a tingling sensation rushing up his arm as the red string connecting them sent back into their skin. There would always remain a circle of red where it had rested, warm to the touch whenever they were near. Perhaps it was the chaos of the era they lived in, but it was clear that neither Madara nor Tobirama had ever witnessed a pair of soulmates touch for the first time. They were both staring at where the fate line had disappeared like they expected it to pop back into existence, maybe gain sentience and shout surprise. Minato tightened his grip when he realized that Madara had no intentions of letting him go anytime soon. His smile was just a tad apprehensive as he asked, "You mentioned something about leaving the village." HMTH, Madara didn't seem to appreciate having the moment ruined. "Would you want to work every day with the man who killed your brother?" "No, I suppose I wouldn't." Staying was not an option, though I tried for Hashirama's sake. He shrugged, still careful not to dislodge their hands, and Minato relaxed ever so slightly. "That makes you a good friend." Tobirama snorted, but they paid him no mind as he ever so casually began to sidle towards the entrance. It was probably all anyone could ask of them that they hadn't tried too seriously to kill each other on sight. Both of them cared dearly for the Shodan Hokage in their own ways, and despite their hatred for each other, they were well aware that either of their deaths would cause the other man great pain. In that light, it probably was the best course of action that Madara leave the village. "Give your brother my regards when you return," Minato called just before his friend disappeared into the passageway. Tobirama halted in his tracks and spun back around with his jaw hanging loose. "You won't be coming?" he demanded. Keeping his gaze locked with Madara's, Minato shook his head. "I already devoted one life to that village. I'll come if you need me, but I think my place is here. For now it's my soulmate that needs me the most." He knew he'd made the right decision by the pleasantly surprised look Madara gave him. In his memories, his life in the other timeline had been filled with a need to do more, to prove himself, to protect the village and all its people, but he was not that self anymore. Something told him the two of them would be just fine here as long as they had each other. Chapter 142, Madara, Tobirama, the one where their opinion leaves marks. When he first saw them, Tobirama didn't think much of it. What skin was visible beneath the flare of Madara's robe looked covered in bruises, but that made a lot of sense when they saw each other only in battle. Of course he had bruises after fighting Hashirama so often. Not many people could face the Mukiden and come away with unmarked skin. Tobirama's eyes slid past the marks as soon as he saw them, easily dismissing such an insignificant detail in favor of checking to make sure that Hashirama was fine before bringing all concentration back to his own battle. The next time he saw them they were at peace, and Madara hadn't so much as sparred with Hashirama since the final battle between their clans. Still, there was little reason for Tobirama to suspect anything beyond the usual injuries picked up during the life of a shinobi. His own skin was marred so badly he hadn't been seen without long sleeves since childhood. He could be forgiven for thinking such things were normal. Seeing Madara's robe fall open ever so slightly as he slammed his hands down on the table to yell at the Senju elders was barely worth his notice at the time. More important was defending his clanmates and fighting to make sure the Senju came out as well as he could manage in these stupid peace negotiations. After that he mostly forgot about the bruises. He'd never particularly cared to remember any unnecessary details about such an unwanted aberration in his life. Tobirama didn't see them again until the village was built and he was standing uneasily to the side as Hashirama and Madara had their very first friendly spar in more than a decade, watching their every move with worry heavy in his chest. What if that cretin took advantage of this moment to finally show his true colors and no one was here to help poor naive Hashirama? No matter that their match dragged on for more than an hour with no sign of foul play, still he continued to lurk on the edges with his eyes trained on Madara's every twitch and shift. Just because nothing suspicious had happened yet didn't mean nothing would if he let his guard down and left. It was only when they finished, laughing and falling back on what looked more like play fighting than an actual spar, that Tobirama happened to see Madara's robe slip and expose a large swath of what should have been pale chest. His skin was dark, mottled purple and back and red, welts upon bruises upon scabrous sores all hidden underneath his clothing, a mirror image of Tobirama's own skin. Were it anyone else, Tobirama knew he would have felt a rush of empathy for someone suffering the same fate as him, bearing the physical wounds of his own soulmate's hatred without even know who they were, but this was Madara. This was the man who had stolen his brother's affection and attention. This was an Uchiha monster barely worthy of human consideration. Someone like him didn't deserve sympathy. No, Tobirama felt nothing but vindictive satisfaction, mentally applauding whoever the man's soulmate was on their good sense. Who the hell would want to be matched to someone like that? Even seeing the marks firsthand didn't truly make them stick in his mind, still. Tobirama slowly grudgingly admitted that it was fine to leave Madara and his brother alone in a room together. He still didn't trust the Uchiha, but whatever plans he had seemed to run in vain with Hashirama's ideas of peace. For now, at least. Most of what little attention Tobirama could spare for those first few years went to Azuna and the strange shifting dynamic of their old rivalry. The two of them would never be great friends, but they did learn to get along somewhat, enough so that they were able to refrain from screaming in each other's faces when forced to work together. It was about as much as could be asked of either man. The rest of Tobirama's attention was taken up by the distracting mystery of his own skin. He hadn't really noticed at first, so subtle were the changes, but the wounds marring his body were slowly receding until he began to see patches of clear, unbroken skin. He could remember times in his youth when he had found open weeping sores with no physical cause, evidence of the incredible hatred his soulmate felt for him. Now, though he still had no idea who they were, he was treated to the privilege of watching that opinion change day by day. Somewhere in the world there existed a man or woman who was learning to forgive him for whatever he had done to earn the hatred. With such an amazing thing happening to himself and still so busy trying to properly build the village of his brother's dreams, Tobirama had no spare thoughts for Madara until miraculously and almost without him noticing they had been at peace for 5 solid years. Hashirama insisted on a festival to celebrate, and Tobirama refused to be in the room with the two older men whenever they let their heads run away from them with planning. It was like herding 2 excitable children, though only Hashirama smiled like one. Konohagaku's 5-year anniversary celebration was the day when Tobirama's world turned upside down completely. For the life of him he would never remember what Torifu had been talking about, chattering away in his ear and tugging on the sleeve of his tightly fastened yakada. His memory always focused on the moment someone bumped into his student from behind and sent the boy tumbling backwards with his fingers still holding tightly on Tobirama's clothing. The ripping sound of expensive cloth was only barely visible about the noise of the crowds, but the swaths of clear pale skin suddenly on display certainly caught more than a few people's attention. His insistence on staying covered at all times had led to him being called a prude in many corners. Showing a bit of skin was almost scandalous in that light. Still, he wasn't sure that warranted the look Madara gave his exposed chest, unadulterated hunger mixed with a deep, deep pain. It was one of the strangest looks he had ever been on the receiving end of. And being both an albino and one of the strongest shinobi alive, Tobirama had seen his fair share of odd expressions. "Madara, please," Hashirama whined, pinching his nose. "I'm right here." "What?" "I'm not doing anything. It's okay if you have a crush on him, I'm fine with it. Just tone down whatever gross thoughts you've got in your head right now, okay? I don't want to see that. He is my brother after all." Hashirama boomed out a laugh and whacked his friend on the back, completely ignoring the stunned reactions of everyone in earshot. Tobirama stared at the man now blushing furiously and avoiding his eyes, feeling like the earth was tightening out from underneath him as his mind made a few intuitive leaps that he wished it hadn't. He could feel the blood thundering in his own ears when he stepped forward to grab Madara by the arm and drag him aside. "Play nice, you guys," Hashirama called after them. Both of them ignored their hokage as Tobirama dragged them into the shadows between 2 food stalls, shoving the older man up against a wooden beam. "Are we soulmates?" he demanded. Even before Madara could scrounge up a reply, the answer was obvious. The hesitant longing in his eyes, the way his throat bobbed with sudden nerves, the curl of his body as though he wished for nothing more than to reach out for something yet dared not to. Drawing in a shaky breath, Tobirama reeled backwards a step and dragged both hands down his face. "I didn't expect you to figure it out," Madara admitted quietly. Dropping his hands again, Tobirama stared at the man, unable to answer. From the moment they met as young children on opposite sides of a generations-long war, he had hated this person. He had hated Madara with the sort of passion which can only come from mindless devotion without reason. It had only gotten worse after that day on the banks of the Naka River when Madara had been solidified in his mind as the one who took his brother's affections away from him. Hashirama had forgiven him years ago, of course, but things had never been quite the same between them after that. Negative though it was, his hatred had been one of the very few constants in Tobirama's life, something to fall back on when he needed a sense of normalcy. And he had thought Madara felt the same towards him. Never once had it occurred to him that any Uchiha besides his cute little student felt anything other than visceral dislike and perhaps a grudging respect for him. Such assumptions were irrefutably disproved by the clear skin he saw every day in the mirror, the utter lack of bruises or scratches, the healing of any lingering scars. In fact, the smoothing over of even the scars he had earned himself in battle was what truly brought his mind to a screeching halt, the one thing that left him feeling like he suddenly recognized nothing in the world around him. If they truly were soulmates, then Madara's opinion of him would show in the condition of his skin, injuries that grew more severe the more the man hated him or cleared away the more the man grew to care for him. Scars, on the other hand, were their own indicator. Only love could heal scars, deep, true, unbending romantic love. And Madara had not expected him to figure this out. Which, by extension, meant that he had figured it out and deliberately kept the secret. And also that Madara was in love with him by some wild twist of circumstances. "I think I need to sit down," he heard himself mumble. His companion twisted like he was trying to fold in on himself. "Your opinion on the matter is clear enough without words. Rest assured, I expect nothing. I never have." "How long?" Tobirama trailed off, his eyes drawn to the white collar of Madara's formal robes, just that little bit lower than his usual clothing that allowed Tobirama a glimpse of the dark skin hidden beneath. It was easy to look at those marks and feel a spiteful satisfaction when he thought Madara felt only the same hatred between them. Seeing them and knowing it was himself who put such wounds on another person's body made everything different, even without knowing that his own skin was perfectly clear, soft and unmarked. Madara shrugged and looked away, avoiding the question he hadn't finished asking anyway. Nearly choking himself on all the conflicting emotions rising in his throat, Tobirama stumbled back a step. Later he would be mortified that he hadn't even had the courage to excuse himself, only bolted like a child frightened by a new concept too big to be fathomed, but at the moment all he could concentrate on was the panic overriding all other senses. He was reaching for the farthest Terratian marker in the village before he could talk himself down. A moment later he was leaning back against the outer walls of the village with his hands over his eyes like they could block out the world and give him at least enough time to process the impossibility he had just uncovered. He was gone by the time the next patrol came by, although they did stop to inspect the tuft of white strands where he had pulled out his own hair in frustration. The two of them had never spent a great amount of time together that wasn't forcibly necessary, so it wasn't exactly noticeable how much effort Tobirama put into avoiding the other man for after that. At least, it wasn't at first. He always seemed to forget how observant his older brother was under the usual veneer of childish exuberance. It was Hashirama who approached him with a wobbling chin little more than a month later and begged Tobirama to tell him what they had spoken about at the anniversary festival and what had been so bad about it that neither of them was willing to even talk about the other. Tobirama ignored him, of course, which turned out to be a mistake. Something else he preferred to conveniently forget was his brother's tendency to meddle. He should have been suspicious the moment Hashirama accepted his excuse of just another random argument, should have known that it was a little too easy. He had only his own inattention to blame when he found himself ushered into Hashirama's office to face a startled-looking Madara while Hashirama cheerfully told them he expected them to talk things out and set aside whatever disagreement had them both in a tizzy this time. When the door shut the two of them inside with a gentle click, he winced as though it had been slammed with all the violence of a closing cage. Against all expectations, Madara gave him no more than a single glance before dismissing him and wandering around to throw himself down in a massive chair behind Hashirama's desk, pulling some of the paperwork towards himself and rifling through it, checking as they both often did to make sure their illustrious Hokage had actually filled his forms incorrectly. Tobirama simply stood unmoving by the door, his eyes flitting around the room uncomfortably while he tried to decide if he was more upset that he would now have to murder his own sibling or that he had apparently been worried so much over nothing. Madara didn't even look angry. "You can go." He almost jumped at the sound of Madara's voice. When he dared to peek over in that direction, the man hadn't even bothered to look up, focused on the papers in front of him with his lips quirked up ever so slightly on one side. We can give him some vague bullshit about talking it out, you know he'll swallow it down. So you can go if you like. Why aren't you upset with me? Tobirama forced himself to ask, more curious to know than he was afraid of the answer. Finally Madara looked up at him through dark lashes. Because you don't hate me, the man said quietly. Not as much as you think you do. I beg your pardon. Tobirama narrowed his eyes, fists clenching with instinctive anger. He knew perfectly well how he felt, thank you very much, and no Uchiha had any right to make assumptions about him no matter how often his thoughts turned to them of late. It was only natural to be curious about his own soulmate, after all. Now smiling openly, Madara leaned back in the massive chair and deliberately pushed his sleeves up. Then he simply went back to work as though he were perfectly alone in the room. Tobirama stared hard, trying to figure out what game the idiot was playing at, but when he figured it out he felt all the air in his lungs leave him in a great rush. Just like last time he found himself reaching out for one of his many Horatian marks, running away in a blind panic, though this time he felt the shame of it burning his ears even as he landed in the safety of his own home and stumbled against his kitchen counter, fingers gripping the wood until it threatened to crack. It was only a pair of forearms, nothing to panic over if it had been anyone else. What made these ones so special was the yellow-green color of the bruises on his skin where before they'd been so deeply purple they could have been mistaken for black. It was the fact that they were healing, steadily and obviously, that had Tobirama slumping down at his kitchen table and burying his head in both arms. Perhaps it made him a coward, but he wasn't ready to deal with the fact that his feelings towards the other man were changing. And he rather resented the connection between them betraying his thoughts before he'd had time to come to terms with them himself. Curling a little farther into himself, Tobirama thought about the smile on Madara's face, so content, so pleased, so unlike anything he would have expected. It was the smile of someone who realized they were winning a game before they had ever really begun to play it. It was, he realized, the smile of someone willing to be patient and allow him whatever time he needed to come to terms with things between them. Loath as he was to admit it, that smile terrified Tobirama. Not the least because he found it so intriguing. Chapter 143, Obito Kakashi, the one where you have a journal that connects you. Obito paced back and forth across the rough floor of the cave, one hand tugging fitfully at the lengthening strands of his hair. Somewhere in the back of his mind a half-forgotten memory played of when he'd first met the sage Jiraiya and admired his wild locks only to earn himself a round of teasing as Kakashi told him he would look horrible with long hair. He had no idea if his old teammate was right. There were no mirrors down here in the cavern where he was slowly recovering from his near-death experience. Shaking the memory away impatiently, Obito turned abruptly and marched over to the bed with determined steps. No time to waste on aimless reflection. As long as he stayed quiet he could do this without waking up old man Madara and be done before the Zetsu got back from wherever the hell they kept going. He'd been surprised to discover the journal in his bedside table, nearly as surprised to discover he had a bedside table in this dusty old place until he picked through his foggy, distorted memories and recalled the way it always followed him when they spent the night away from home for missions, even when he double-checked to make sure he hadn't packed it. There was some kind of magic in the journal, of that was sure, something that went beyond the fact that it connected him with his soulmate. It was a magic he'd always felt a little guilty partaking in. Now it had been several months since he'd had a chance to write anything in these pages, months since he'd had contact with any human being beyond the ancient creature dozing on his throne at the other end of the cave. Obito was all but desperate to speak with anybody besides the grouching old fart who claimed to be some kind of living legend and grumbled a lot about perfect worlds and the moon, for whatever reason. Checking one more time to make sure the Zetsu hadn't come back, he slid the drawer of his bedside table open and slipped out the thin black book he'd had all his life. As soon as he opened the cover a pen appeared in his hand like it always did, but for now he clenched his fist around it and used the other to flick through the pages until he found where the writing stopped. There were at least 2 full pages that he hadn't seen yet, filled up with unusually messy writing where he usually found perfectly slanted angles and gorgeously rounded curves. And a lot more punctuation marks than usual too. Obito peeked over at Madara before bending his head to read through the new entries. Apparently he'd worried his soulmate. He winced around the sharp glance of guilt as he read the appeals for him to please come back and say something, anything, that would let his soulmate know he was alive. As much as it had always felt a little like betrayal of his own heart to keep contact with this person while he was still in love with Rin, Obito had never quite been able to shake the habit. They had never exchanged names, but he had missed them just as much as he missed his teammates. It was with relief that he shifted his grip on the pen, preparing to write even while his eyes were still skimming through the latest entry. Then his body froze, his heart skipping a beat. "Please," the kanji on the page implored him. "Please talk to me. I can't lose you too. Not after losing Obito. Sensei says it isn't my fault, but it is. I wasn't fast enough. Please come back. I just need someone to talk to. I can't talk to my other friend. I know she blames me too, even if she doesn't say it. Where are you?" Never before in all the times they had filled this book and had the pages wipe themselves clean to start again, not once had either of them ever slipped up and written any names. It seemed messy writing was not the only mistake his soulmate made while they were caught up in grief and panic. Which, he thought distantly, was an incredible surprise, since apparently his soulmate was Kakashi. Sensations he could barely describe filled him as this information sunk in bit by bit. He felt a great rushing inside of him that had no source, a thundering in his ears that sounded like his own blood. Then suddenly the world around him showed up in amazing detail, sharp and clear like he had never seen it before. Minuscule details he had never noticed before jumped out at him with startling clarity. It was like his Sharingan had suddenly dialed up to 11 and he hadn't even had it activated. He wondered if Kakashi was experiencing the same thing with the other eye he had gifted to his friend. His soulmate, rather. Closing the journal and clutching it tightly to his chest, Obito spun around in place and checked every inch of the walls as he had done 100 times already. This time, however, he was doing so with a strange new attention to detail that showed him fault lines and stress cracks he's never noticed before. He saw the tiniest hint of shadow falling in the wrong direction and realized that meant that Madara had lied to him. There was a way out of this cave. If he hadn't spent several months trapped in here with strange white creatures who could sink into the walls, it might have felt strange to him when he stepped forward and seemed to melt through the very air itself. But Obito was getting pretty used to a strange, so when he passed through what looked like an empty void of darkness and white blocky shapes, his only thought was that he hoped he would be able to find his way back there at some point to check it out again. When he had more time, of course. Right now he was too focused on making his way to Kakashi's side. When the world righted itself again and the sensation of melting through the air faded away, he was standing in the open air for the first time in nearly half a year in the exact spot where he had been separated from his Tain. His eyes closed as he paused for just a moment to enjoy the sensation of wind on his face, grass tickling his toes. Then he dropped his chin and let the journal fall open between his hands. The pen appeared in his fingers as though it had never been gone. "I'm coming home, Kakashi," was all he wrote before snapping the journal shut again and tucking it up underneath his shirt. Obito took his first stumbling steps towards home on knees that weren't used to running anymore, not daring to look up at the moon hanging heavy in the sky above him for fear that it would wink and tell him this was all a dream. He wanted this to be real. If Kakashi was his true soulmate, he wanted to find his way back home and figure this out between them. He could only hope that his friend was willing to wait a little bit longer for him. Chapter 144, Madara Sakura Tobirama, the one where you kiss the pain away. Pain. The stinging burn of acid splashed across his arm, the throb in his side where his enemy's blade had nearly pierced his liver, the hot scrape of air in his throat as his tired lungs begged for oxygen. His right leg strained with every step as the muscle cramped around the 3 senbon sticking out just below his knee. It was possible he'd broken a few ribs as well, though if he stopped to check he would probably collapse here and never make it home. Yet despite his laundry list of injuries, Madara felt tired more than anything else. Home beckoned his leaden feet onwards, twin beacons of safety for his foggy mind to latch onto while the rest of the world faded with every passing minute. Home meant a bed and rest and more hands filled with more love than he ever thought he could deserve. Right now he needed those hands. This entire stupid mission had turned belly up from the moment he left the gates. He should have listened to Hikako and brought backup, but hindsight was 20/20 and pride was always a bitch. All he could do now was limp onwards and dismiss the horrified looks from the guards at the gates while he turned himself down familiar streets, moving on naught but muscle memory. Fingers closed around the door handle of his front door before he even realized where he was, and a whimper of relief escaped him. The second he fell in through the doorway, there were hands to catch him, soothe him, support him, until his stumbling journey ended at last on a soft bed with covers he distantly realized they would have to throw out now. Blood was always so hard to get out once it dried. A bright wash of healing chakra broke through the haze and he smiled faintly, rolling his head to the side in search of pale skin to nuzzle up against. "Isn't that my job?" Sakura's voice asked, an even mix of amusement and worry. "You are more than welcome to join in," Tobirama rumbled from just above where Madara's nose was buried in his neck, all but drowning in the familiar scent. "From the looks of his injuries, it will be better if we both work together anyway. Sweetheart, you know I love to work with you." Madara smiled dreamily as he listened to their banter. The pain was still there, but it seemed to matter less with his soulmates here with him, flirting back and forth like there was nothing wrong. As long as they kept it up, he knew everything would be fine, so he allowed himself to relax into their care without worry. "You still with us?" The question jerked him back to awareness from where he had almost slipped unknowingly into dreamland. Madara turned his face up to reward Tobirama's question with a light nod. "Aha. Tired. Hurts." He tried to shrug, but his limbs felt so heavy he wasn't sure he even managed to move them. Sakura chuckled lolly from his other side. "We can do something about that," she offered. The first press of soft lips made him gasp, for the unexpected gentle touch among so much pain, and then for the way it felt as though a door closing between him and that burning agony, shutting it away into a distant corner of his mind to leave him completely lucid for the first time in hours. He hadn't quite caught his breath yet when he felt Tobirama shift, and then chapped lips were blessing him with the same gift for another of his wounds. One by one his soulmates made their way down his body, peeling his clothes off as they went and leaving him bare to their affections. Madara kept his eyes closed until at last he felt his muscles relax that last little, but they hadn't been able to, completely pain-free, although he was still bleeding sluggishly all over the bedding. Truly the universe knew what it was doing, matching the three of them together. It was a fault they all shared. They didn't get injured very often, but when they did, it usually tended more towards the catastrophic and life-threatening. "I could have done without," he insisted, more because his pride demanded it than because he was actually upset that they had lessened his pain. Sakura and Tobirama gave matching snorts. "Sure," Sakura agreed mildly. "And we could have just bandaged you and left you to heal at a civilian pace." "Just shut up and let us save your life," Tobirama said. "HMPH, fine." Madara opened his eyes finally and made a show of rolling them up towards the ceiling, not deigning to look at either of them as he demanded, "Kiss me again." With a few amused grumbles about having already taken away the pain, both of them granted only a single chaste peck on the cheek. Then he glowered until they took turns drawing him in by the neck and taking his breath away, devouring him as a pleasant distraction to the way the other continued to work on his injuries. Before too long he was drifting again, but this time it was nothing but honest exhaustion and a sense of peace enveloping him here in the place he could be certain he was safe, where he could let his walls down for just a little while and nothing bad would happen other than maybe a bit of light teasing when he inevitably made a fool of himself somehow. "Falling asleep on us," one of them asked. This close to unconsciousness he couldn't tell which one. "MMHN. We'll still be here when you wake," the same voice promised. Madara fell asleep knowing that he would wake with his wounds healed and his body wrapped up in two others, free of pain even if they had to kiss it all away 100 times over. Chapter 145, Hashirama Bazuna, the one where you commission jewelry that leads you to each other. Skimming his fingers over the glass, gaze all but devouring the precious gems nestled protectively below, Izuna wondered what it would be like to be trained in the art of soul crafting, to be born a civilian and follow his heart down whatever path he wanted to. His palms ached to cradle the glittering stones and mold the precious metals into something so beautiful it made others weak to look upon them. Instead he had scars and callous eyes that spun red when adrenaline ran high, and more blood in his dreams than any civilian could fear to see in their entire life. "Have you chosen one?" a soft voice asked him. Izuna sighed, basking in his unwanted longing for a few more seconds before letting go of it. There was no use in wanting something he would never have. He was born to be a shinobi, no other path had ever been available to him, and to wish for one would be to wish for the impossible. "Emerald," he breathed after a few moments. "An emerald, please." The soul crafter did not question his choice, which meant that he had made the right one. Izuna smiled as he watched the man delicately flutter both hands over the inside of the display cabinet before selecting a pillow carrying several tiny little gemstones. Each of them were perfectly cut and caught the light at every turn. The deep green color reminded him of nature, not of spring or new growth, but of the tenacity, the endurance, the everlasting purity and the strength of nature. There was nothing innocent about that color of green, and yet neither could he see any evil. An excellent selection. The soul crafter hummed over the gems for a moment, looking between them and his customer several times. Then he smiled like he'd thought of a great secret. Several, I think. And what metal shall they be cast in? Silver, Izuna answered automatically. He was the second-born, the lesser son, no matter how much love his brother had for Hen. He would never dare to wear gold. Could never bear the weight of it. Very well. I shall have it ready in 3 days. You don't want to ask about the design? The soulcaster only continued to smile at him. I have been listening to the sounds of your soul since you arrived, young man. I know the design you will need. 3 days. Izuna blinked but didn't bother to ask further. Most people visited a soulcaster when they were young, picking out the gem and the precious metal which spoke to them the most to create the piece of jewelry which would guide them to the person they were meant to be with. He should have gone when he was a child, had set out with his father to do so once, but they had been ambushed on the journey and there never seemed to be time again after that. It felt strange to stand in the shop and look at displays that had been lowered to stand at a height for children to gaze into. The embarrassment was easier to ignore when he reminded himself why he was here. 3 days from now he would have his own very own guide, the piece of jewelry that would connect him to the one person his soul yearned for the most. No one but those who studied the art knew exactly how a soul crafter created them, and not everyone who applied for the training was accepted, but nearly every person in the world had commissioned their services at some point in their life. There were many who refused to wear any adornments except their guiding jewelry. Izuna himself had never accepted any gifts of necklaces or brooches, not even the scarf sewn with golden thread and pearls that a prospective suitor had tried to gift him once. It just felt wrong for some reason. Waiting was difficult. Their father had been settled in his grave for a full year before Izuna found the courage to ask his brother's permission to make this trip, and he had been pleasantly surprised to be gifted an entire week of leave. Now he understood why he needed it. It was hard not to just march into the shop and station himself right in the middle of the room until it was ready, but he knew better. Soul crafters were venerated even above the daimyo himself. He would never insult one of them like that, even if they weren't making him the single most important accessory he would ever own. Instead, he spent the 3 days wandering around the village he was visiting and paying attention to the way certain things were set up. Madara's piece looked like it was finally sticking, despite the elders having more and more audacious demands every time they met with the Senju to rewrite the treaty. Izuna very much doubted that there was room in his brother's head of drains for things like road planning or market layouts. He knew that Ret Tobarama was probably thinking of these things and more, but Izuna would be damned if he let his old rival show up the Uchiha like that. He would be prepared with some suggestions of his own to show Tobarama he wasn't the only smart person around. Madara might have the bigger muscles, but Izuna had the bigger brain. His nerves were so strung out by the time all 3 days had passed and he was able to go back to the shop that he very nearly didn't spot the 2 figures on the rooftop above him when he left the inn. Stopping dead with one hand reaching for his kunai holster out of habit, Izuna narrowed his eyes at where the 2 Senju brothers were looking back at him with mild surprise. Tobarama glared and turned his head. Hashirama waved cheerfully. "We didn't expect to see you here, Izukun," the Senju clan head called down. Izuna twitched. "Don't call me that," he snapped. Hashirama gasped and drooped with sadness while Tobarama dropped his face into one palm. Izuna shifted his weight and tried to decide how he wanted to handle this situation. Technically they weren't really at peace yet, not until the treaty had been signed, but to attack these 2 now would erase all the hard work his brother had been fighting for, not to mention get his speed. No matter how confident he was in his own skills, not even Madara could face both of the Senju siblings together and hope to live. "Move along, little Uchiha," Tobarama said with a shooing motion. "We didn't come here to bother you." "Oh, be nice, Todi. He's an ally now." "By Azunake-san." Hashirama tittered nervously over his almost slip but waved again just the same before tugging his brother along with him and leaping away towards the red light district. They were probably here to meet with some sort of seedy contact. Every clan had some informants they weren't exactly proud to associate with, but those usually tended to be the invaluable ones with ears in all the right places. Izuna put the retreating Senju out of his mind easily. As weird as it was not attacking each other on sight, too much of his attention was taken up by the excitement of receiving his guide today. He tried not to smile too weirdly as he hurried through the streets towards the deceptively modest shop at the very edge of the marketplace. He's seen soul crafters in the bigger cities with marble facing on the front of their shops, grand designs carved into the lintel and fine silks hung in the window. It wasn't just the shorter distance which lured him here to this village so close to where his own client compound lay, it was the simplistic humility of the man who welcomed him into the shop with a nod and a knowing smile. Clearly this man had pursued his craft for the joy of it, not the prestige. It wasn't like he made any money off of it. Guides were freely made and freely given. And in return, soul crafters were supported freely by their community and provided with the finest jewels available. Welcome back, Uchiha-san. I have something here that will lead you to the one you are looking for. You have my gratitude, Izuna told him, bowing low. The man shook his head. Do not bow until you have seen it, eh? Chuckling quietly, the man pushed a small box across the top of a glass case holding different colored quartz samples. Izuna felt like a child as he snatched it up and cradled it against his chest for a moment before opening the lid with fumbling fingers. His heart nearly stopped beneath his ribs when he laid eyes on his guide for the first time. 10 small emeralds had been cast in a ring of purest silver, each placed in their own delicate little leaf, and it looked just the right size to slip on the third finger of his left hand. As he turned the ring to admire it from as many angles as possible, he couldn't help but gape like a simpleton at the way it caught the light and almost seemed to shift the emeralds between endless shades of green. It's perfect, he breathed. You deserve 100 bows and endless thanks. I have nothing to offer you that could possibly be repayment enough. You need offer me nothing, the man denied him. Transaction complete, he turned away and hummed a little tune to himself as he headed towards the workshop at the back of the store. He was out of sight even as Izuna opened his mouth to offer a protest. Suddenly alone, Izuna licked his lips and gently pulled the ring out of its box. While he was in town, he would need to pick up some cleaning solution to make sure he kept it in good condition and maybe some polish so that it kept its beautiful shine. It would have to come off for the missions where he might be getting his hands really dirty, but every shinobi knew how to get blood out of jewelry. He could remember practicing on his mother's necklace when she came home from battle wearing the vestiges of smoke like a crown and a gentle smile just for him. The ring slid onto his hand like it had always been a part of him, cool against the warmth of his skin. It felt odd having something between his fingers stopping them from touching, but it was a good sort of odd. Izuna twisted to admire it into sunlight and dropped his jaw with shock to see the jewels begin to glow. Was this how he was supposed to find his soulmate? Exactly how the guide brought you both together varied from person to person. For some people their designs were the same. For others the shape was significant to one or both of them. Izuna's, apparently, lit up when he turned in a certain direction. It was hard to misinterpret, at least. He tested it a few times, turning in all sorts of directions and pointing his hand without turning his body, but as soon as he understood the rules of what made it glow, he was dashing out the door and rushing off in that direction. Madara had been kind enough to grant him a full week of leave, and he'd only used 3 days so far. He could cover a lot of ground in 2 days to get a general sense of where to search for his soulmate and then use the last 2 days to make it back home in time. Plan said in his mind, Izuna was across town and 2 miles out when he thought to look down at his ring again, only to find that it had stopped glowing. A quick check revealed that it was telling him to double back in the opposite direction. His first thought was that he had made a mistake in which way to go. When he hurried back to the shop where he had started from, however, it was still telling him to go northwest, down exactly the same street as before. Confused, he decided maybe it was better to proceed more slowly. It seemed a bit too much of a coincidence that his soulmate could be in the same city at the same time when he just happened to finally commission his guide, but he supposed he'd rather be safe than sorry. He could afford an hour or two to make sure he was going about this whole thing properly. Izuna bit his lip with focused determination and marched forward where the glow directed him. At one point the glow disappeared without warning and he spun in a circle 4 times just to confirm his new direction before taking off on a more western path than northwest. He almost missed the Senju brothers coming back up the street towards him, almost running straight into Hashirama head first. It seemed the clan head was as distracted as he was, head lowered to look at something on his arm it looked like, but Izuna could care less what they were doing. Tobarama took the time to glare at him suspiciously as he skirted around them both and continued on his way. And then his ring stopped glowing again. Izuna frowned, spinning in a circle like he had before, frustrated when he realized it was telling him to double back for a second time. He was starting to think he had misinterpreted what the glowing was supposed to mean. There was no sense in making him run back and forth for no reason. No, back this way now, he heard one of the Senju say behind him. We just came from that direction, Tobarama whined. It was jarring to hear him old rival express such a human emotion as minor annoyance. He didn't like it. Maybe they are close, Toby. All right, all right. So turn around then. Izuna was paying attention to his own situation mostly, but he was too much of a shinobi and too long at war with those two for him to put them out of his mind entirely when they were this close. One small part of him stayed alert to track their movements while he stepped forward just as they did, passing each other on the street once more. He stopped walking almost at the same time as they did as well when the jewels of his guide released their glow yet again. He almost but straight through his lip, an impossible and unwanted idea occurring to him. Whipping around, he stared at the two Senju with intent eyes, watching Hashirama fiddle with something on his wrist while Tobarama grumbled quietly, fingers pointing vaguely in Izuna's direction. From the few sentences he had overheard, it seemed they were doing the same thing. He was too much of a coincidence for him not to at least indulge the wild thought that this might be something stupid like fate. Tobarama spared him another suspicious look but said nothing when Izuna edged carefully around them, eyes flickering between them and the ring on his finger. He managed to do a full circuit around the two men before Hashirama noticed his presence as well, but that was all he needed to confirm something so unbelievable he almost couldn't take it in. One of them was his soulmate. No matter what angle he stood at, the ring lit up only when he pointed it at the two Senju brothers. His guide was leading him right here to them. Of all the possible reactions he'd imagined himself having, all he found himself thinking about was that if his soulmate turned out to be Tobarama, he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to figure out a way to yell at the gods in person. No one deserved that kind of headache, not even his poor little cousin Kadami, who waxed poetic about the albino every time he was allowed to come along for the peace talks. Foolish, misguided young thing. Anija, Tobarama bit out between clenched teeth, I think your problem is solving itself. Hashirama looked up at his sibling and Izuna was startled to notice that such a battlefield titan was capable of making such a cute, wide-eyed expression. But Toby, this doesn't make any sense. My guide has never just randomly gotten warm like this before. I thought maybe my soulmate was here, but do you think it's broken? What do you mean the problem is solving itself? I don't understand any of this. Hashirama flashed around and waved his arms, giving Izuna a glimpse of the bracelet circle in his wrist, something he'd never noticed before as it was usually hidden under the luminous sleeves. It was a rare piece, not a single gem to be found, but cast entirely of gold shaped to look like flames circling round his arm. Silently he commended the skill of the one who had crafted it. The little flames almost seemed to flicker and jumped right before his eyes. Point it that way, Tobarama told him in a tired voice. All right. And I'm going to take my leave now before anything disgusting happens. What dash? Toby, where are you dash? Oh. It's warm again. Toby, come back, my guide is warm again, and oh, hello again, Izuna-san. Hashirama's smile was cheerful and polite, if a little distracted. Izuna stared at him in wordless shock until Hashirama looked down to see where the green light was coming from, smiling growing impossibly wider when he spotted the ring with its 10 little glowing gems. Pretty. Are you looking for your soulmate too? He asked. I think I found them, Izuna swallowed nervously, but Hashirama only continued to smile, not understanding, so he forced himself to continue. My guide only glows when I pointed at you. I think we're soulmates, Senju-san. Watching understanding dawn in Hashirama's eyes was like watching the sun come up over the horizon, bright and beautiful and mesmerizing in a way he couldn't properly explain. It made him wonder why he had never taken the time to notice how attractive this man was. Actually, he knew the answer to that. Years of being raised to hate each other had blinded him to seeing anything but an opening for attack, but now he was close enough to admire the strength of Hashirama's jawline, the perfect earthy brown of his eyes, and the brilliance of his happiness just before the man threw himself forward to wrap Izuna in a tight hug. Really? That's amazing. He stood to his full height with his arms still locked around Azuna, lifting him right off the ground. It should not have made him flush, but he couldn't stop his cheeks from flooding with hate. It is. Of course. Hashirama squeezed him until he squeaked in protest. I wonder why it took us so long to find each other. Not that it matters, I'm just happy to know now. It's so romantic, don't you think? Like star-crossed lovers. Izuna squirmed until he was set back on his own feet, though Hashirama did not release him entirely and he did not ask to be let go. When he tilted his head up, he found his vision filled entirely by Hashirama's face. It wasn't nearly as terrible of a sight as he might have expected even just earlier that day. The longer he stared, the less he wanted to look away, finding more and more details to appreciate. Maybe I'm not totally against this. It would be a good way to solidify the peace between our clans. His fingers punched in the material of Hashirama's sleeves until he worried about his chakra-enhanced strength misshaping the brand new ring on his finger, yet he couldn't seem to make himself let go. I didn't even think of that, Hashirama said. Izuna lifted one eyebrow. Really? I would have thought that was the first thing on your mind. You and Aniki are so obsessed with making this piece work. Yeah, but you're really cute, Azuna-san. Leaning in just a little bit closer, something in Hashirama's smile changed in a way he couldn't define, a way that made his knees turn to water. Since we are soulmates, can I call you Izuku now? To combat the sudden urge to burst into flames, Izuna buried his face in Hashirama's chest, more glad than ever that his rival had given them a bit of privacy for this moment. Madara is going to be so happy and so mad at the same time, he deflected. Hashirama went stiff in his arms, and Azuna finally remembered how his brother used to go on and on about the man's mood swings, how sudden and rapid they could be. Feeling Hashirama droop against him in a way that pressed their bodies together, he thought to himself that he was more than willing to ride this roller coaster for the sake of peace, of course. Chapter 146, Tobirama Azuna, the one where you must ask them. Did you ever think about asking someone that, like, you would never expect is the right one? No. Tobirama tilted his head out from behind the shelf to lift an eyebrow at the man his brother was forcing him to work with. If I didn't think they were a correct match for me, then I didn't see the point in wasting my breath to ask them the question. Izuna wrinkled his nose with irritation. Well, you never know, do you? Like, Aniki really didn't think it would be Orofa brother that was matched to him, but look at them now. Disgusting but happy. I want to be offended and say don't call my brother an oaf, but he is an oaf. You are unfortunately correct. Tobirama paused, giving some thought to saying more, then shook his head and went back to rooting through the archive shelves. If it were anyone else here with him, he might have written off the short conversation as insignificant, entirely forgettable, but this was Azuna. He was fairly sure that was the closest thing to a normal conversation they'd been able to have in months. Certainly it was the first question his soulmate had asked him that wasn't couched in a sharp tone or followed by an insult. To say they didn't really get along would be to misinterpret things, however. It wasn't that they couldn't stand each other. Rather, he would have said that they simply didn't know how to handle each other. Madara and Hashirama had been able to put aside a lifetime of enmity as easily as yesterday's clothing, but they had something no one else did in either clan. They'd had the chance to get to know each other as innocents before the generations-long war came between them. For Tobirama and Azuna, things were different. Things were much more complicated. No friendship had ever existed between them in the past or present, nothing but rivalry and hatred until the day they discovered the connection between them quite by accident. If not for Azuna mockingly asking him the question, they likely never would have known. Does your brother really think we are going to get along better if he makes us work on drafting this stupid bylaw together? Hashirama liked to imagine that there is good in everyone, Tobirama said, not lifting his eyes from the boring text he was now perusing. Even where there clearly is none. Was that a fucking crack at me? If you choose to see it as one, go fuck yourself. He didn't bother to watch Azuna storm out of the room, most likely to go beg himself off of this project. As soon as he was alone, Tobirama closed his eyes and forced himself to nothing more than breathe slowly for a few moments, trying to calm his racing heart. Knowing that his brother meant well did nothing to detract from his urge to commit violence against the idiot. More than a year had passed, peace had been made, an entire village was built and half running, and still it was no less of a shock now than it had been then. He still woke some mornings and asked himself if he really was soulmates with Uchiha Azuna. It all just seemed too much like a terrible dream to be true, and yet here they were, living in the same village, forced to work together, and no longer allowed to commit proper violence against each other. Expelling these pointless thoughts with a deep sigh, Tobirama refocused his mind on the task at hand. If he was going to do this project entirely by himself, then he should probably get to work. I didn't even want a soulmate. Clutching his dish of sake tighter, Izuna made sure his expression did not shift an inch. No way in hell would he ever let Tobirama know just how hard those words had hit him. He wasn't exactly thrilled about their match either, but to know that his soulmate hadn't wanted him even before they knew each other's identity. To know that he would never had stood a chance of being wanted ever if they hadn't been at war. His teeth ground together and the nails of his free hand dug into his palm as he strove to appear unaffected. Well, lucky for you then, he spat. Then he turned and walked away without another word, leaving Tobirama blinking after him owlishly. That was unkind, Hashirama murmured to his brother. How much have you had to drink? It was not untrue. And this is precisely why. Tossing back his seventh dish of sake, Tobirama huffed and waved vaguely at the spot Izuna had just vacated. I never wanted to put myself through this. Better to know from the wound that I will be alone than to have my hopes dashed so completely. Maybe you should think about explaining that part to Izuna. Tobirama shrugged. I was going to, but he left. Prick. He protested quite loudly when Hashirama took away the rest of his sake, quieting only when he was firmly told to go home for the night. That was nice. He'd been wanting to go home since the moment he arrived here to this stupid office party, as Hashirama had called it. Getting lectured on his way up the door was worth it to be allowed to go home and finish his evening in the quiet of his own room, staring up at the ceiling and wondering if he would have been any happier to have anyone else turn out to be his soulmate. You want us to what? To spar? Hashirama baned and Izuna narrowed his eyes to stare harder. Is that the best idea? Really? Not that I'm opposed to being given permission to break his bonds. He gave a careless shrug. But I think my brother will be angry with you when your brother automatically goes for blood. Oh, he won't do that. Come on. It'll be a good way for you two to get out all that extra energy. After a quick check to make sure that, yes, the Hokage really had just said that, Izuna gave in with a roll of his eyes. How anyone could refer to the aggression between them as a bit of extra energy was beyond him, but at least the stupid plan had a silver lining. If he tries to kill me, I'm not going to feel guilty defending myself in kind, he warned. Hashirama laughed, clearly thinking he was joking, and Izuna didn't bother to correct that assumption. Just let them try to charge him with murder. He hadn't wanted this situation he'd found himself in, but he was not above taking the easy way out of it should the option present itself. Since birth he had been training to fight Tobirama, to end his existence and triumph over his bloody corpse. Izuna wasn't sure he had it in him to change courses the way the rest of the world seemed to want them to. Calling a tie just feels unsatisfactory. I almost had you at the end. Please, you're as exhausted as I am. Besides, if I had been allowed to use my Haration, you would have been dead a dozen times over hours ago. You fucking wish. Several minutes of silence passed as the two of them lay stretched out on their backs in the grass, neither able to move even just to lift an arm or leg. Hashirama had been right about one thing, they certainly had used up a lot of energy. In the end, however, neither one of them had been able to best the other in any significant sort of way, and neither had been willing to call the match to a close until they had collapsed almost side by side, unable to go on. A rather annoying voice in the back of his head murmured that they were, if nothing else, perfectly matched in this respect. It sparked the tiniest flame of curiosity for whether they were well matched in other things, but Izuna was quick to smother that little flicker. He could care less. I think I'm tired of death. Tobirama spoke quietly and without warning, but while Izuna was still racking his brain for some kind of a response to that, he was struggling to his feet and slowly limping away. Izuna was left there alone to lay on the training field and wonder what the hell that was supposed to mean. So what, we're regressing back to childhood now? Izuna, please. Where he was used to seeing nothing but blank arrogance or varying degrees of anger, Tobirama looked nothing more than tired now as he rubbed harshly at the bridge of his nose. If you have a better solution, then I am willing to hear it out, but clearly the universe has made some sort of mistake. Oh, on a mistake am I. Look, I know you didn't want any soulmate, but you got me, so fucking deal with it like an adult. Pretending I don't exist is not dealing with it. Izuna crossed his arms and leaned back against the wall moodily. It wasn't like he wanted Tobirama any more than the other man wanted him, but it still galled to know Tobirama was just giving up like this. Wasn't he supposed to be the boneheaded one who never let an idea go once he sunk his claws into it? This was the same stubborn as who gave the same lecture in every council meeting for 6 months until finally the rest of them caved and agreed to consider the idea of a ranking system for the missions given out. For him to announce out of the blue that it would be best if they no longer spoke outside of necessary work contact felt oddly painful. Like being rejected in a contest he hadn't wanted to win anyway and yet somehow got invested in without noticing. Tobirama was infamous for his stubbornness. And here he was giving up on Izuna so easily. A ridiculous statement. Izuna had known from the start that neither of them wanted each other. It was their brothers shoving them together, crying peace and patience. Why should it make a difference now that he was finally getting what he'd thought he wanted all along? This is the logical course of action, Tobirama said, eyes focused somewhere over Izuna's shoulder. We both know that we will never be able to set aside our past. If we know that we are doomed to fail, then what is the point of trying? The most logical thing to do would be to simply go our separate ways. You live your life and I will live mine. I will speak to Hashirama about this ridiculous notion that he can make us see reason where there is no reason to say. You know what? Fuck your reason and fuck your logic. He couldn't have said why, but Izuna had never been more angry, more insulted in all his life. I thought you would agree. Well, I don't. Pushing off the wall, he stormed over to invade Tobirama's personal space, pushing himself up onto the balls of his feet so they were nose to nose. You don't get to give up on me as easy as that. Fuck your stupid logical conclusions or whatever. I could be an amazing soulmate. You know what? Said Will. I'm gonna be the best goddamn soulmate you could ever fucking hope for. So there. Glaring at the other man from so close, he didn't have time to see Tobirama coming, let alone decide how to react. 1 second he was full of righteous anger, and the next he was back up against the wall with 6 feet of albino muscle devouring him, burning him up from the inside out. The first thing he registered was the heat ripping through his veins. The second thing he noticed were his fingers, clenched round fistfuls of startlingly soft white hair with no memory of having moved them. His eyes snapped open when it finally registered that they were kissing, frantic and heated and with more passion than they had ever fought each other with. Stupidly, the thing his scattered attention chose to latch onto was the way Tobirama looked, oddly relaxed, no stress lines around his eyes for once in his life, and that it was sort of, maybe just a little bit, perhaps attractive. Kind of. Somehow even more surprising than the kiss itself was that Tobirama was the one to end it by reeling backwards, one hand clapped over his mouth and both eyes wide with shock. The two of them stared at each other wordlessly until Tobirama turned and for possibly the first time in his life he fled a battle before it could be fought, flickering away with that stupid jutsu of his. Izuna licked his lips absently. For all the hatred between them he should have tasted blood. All his tongue found was a hint of green tea and a strange craving for more. May I ask you a question? Izuna turned away from the window and offered the Hokage an innocent smile. Of course. Why is my brother so afraid of you lately? By the suspicious look on Hashirama's face it was clear that he thought Izuna was at fault for whatever had happened. Not a clue, Izuna lied easily. Really, I think he's more afraid of himself than he is of me. Oh. Huh. That's weird. Yes, absolutely ridiculous. He should absolutely be more afraid of me. Izuna grinned wider at Hashirama's look of confused consternation, amused to know that the one time he did not mean that in a violent way was the one time he was finally taken seriously. He did mean it though, if not in the way Hashirama had taken it. Tobirama was not the only stubborn person in this village. Izuna had made a declaration to be the best soulmate ever, and he very much intended to follow through with it, just as he very much intended not to examine his own reasons for doing so. For now he would focus on this new method he had discovered of torturing his errant other half. Heavy introspection about why he was suddenly so set on being a good soulmate and pinning Tobirama down for more kisses could be put off until later. Much later. Perhaps never. What did he care for the why when he could make Tobirama blush and run with just one look? This promised to be very entertaining. Chapter 147, Naruto, Kurua plus Sakura, Samui, the one where you know them by touch. But it was a clone. Let it go, doofus. Sakura sighed and tilted her head, scratching awkwardly at the base of her neck. Less than a minute of knowing those two were soulmates, and it was obvious they were a good match. Naruto needed someone with the energy to keep up with him, she supposed. You already punched my clone in the face. That was a good punch, too. Kurua preened, unmoved by the way Naruto stomped both feet in protest as they all walked back towards the village. Well, they're exact copies of me, so that should have worked, Tibaya. HMPH. It didn't, so get over it. And I got to take out my frustration and anger just like he said. I don't get why you're so upset right now. Setting both hands on her hips, Kurui shook her finger under Naruto's nose as she continued to lecture him on the proper etiquette to follow when you've just met your soulmate for the first time. Sakura watched them go at each other with a smile until she heard the Kumo guy behind her muttered to himself and slowed her steps to better hear what he was saying. Curiosity kept the shinobi alive, after all. But what if the first touch does work on a clone and that clone is really far away? Then it disperses the clone and you get the memories, but your new soulmate doesn't know where you are. So of course they go looking for you and you go looking for them, but you both go looking in the wrong spot and you never find each other. It would be a disaster. Give it a rest, Omoi. Another figure in traditional Kumo garb dropped down from the treetops, short blonde hair swaying and eyes narrowed. How goes the intelligence gathering? I hope you haven't gotten into trouble. Omoi, as he was apparently called, immediately became more serious. And never mind that. We learned that Lord Killer Bee is alive. Falling back to where Sai was slinking along behind them all, Sakura tried to give their visitors the space they needed to talk about their captured comrade. She didn't regret following Naruto in secret when he'd left to go tell them everything he knew about Sasuke, but she was well aware that none of what was going on at the moment had anything to do with her. It was probably best if she stayed out of the conversation as much as possible. At least until they all got back to their village where the three strangers had been given permission to look over the intel they came looking for. Sakura had every intention of interfering with that if she was able to. Observing quietly from the back of the group, she bided her time as the conversation petered out and they all set off again, keeping to herself until they made their way back to where Konoha existed as a sea of canvas and bare wood in the wake of Pain's attack. Naruto had quieted, finally settling down about the method in which he'd found his soulmate, and it was kind of cute to watch the way he flashed with pleasure every time Kurua met his gaze. After the lonely life he had lived for so many years, she supposed it was quite a big deal for him to find his soulmate. Kurua seemed like a confident woman too, boldly saying what she thought and not flinching away from his overabundance of energy. Their little ragtag group stopped once they reached the base of the Hokage monument, the only untouched piece of their beloved village, and Sakura noticed Sai slipping away from them in the corner of her eye. She dismissed him easily. Right now she had her own agenda. From the sounds of it, Naruto seemed determined to follow his new soulmate into the secret archives. If she could think of an excuse for her to follow as well, she might be able to disrupt their work somehow, or maybe even steal some of the information they were trying to get on Sasuke. It was a pleasure meeting you, the leader of the Kumo trio, Samui told them all politely. Sakura saw her chance and stepped forward to shake the woman's hand. Our pleasure, of course. If you're going to bring Naruto along, then perhaps I should come too. That doofus wouldn't know a bookshelf from a nightstand, let alone which book goes where. Her smile rather neatly covered the laughter bubbling up at Naruto's indignant squawk. Samui eyed her speculatively, a searching gaze that told Sakura she hadn't been quite as subtle as she hoped, but still Samui reached out to accept her handshake. They gasped at the same time the moment their fingers brushed. Bells rang inside her head, entire choruses singing inside her soul, and her heart felt ready to leap out of her chest and lay itself gently across Samui's palm in honest supplication. And maybe you should come with us, Samui mumbled, visibly shaken. Yes, please. Mortified by the way her voice came out as little more than a high squeak, Sakura nibbled her lower lip and lowered her eyes, shy in a way she hadn't been since she was 12 years old and flustering over a boy who never paid her any attention. Sakura-chan, why are you both acting so funny all of a sudden? Naruto dragged his attention away from Karui at last to give her a funny look. Ha ha ha, your face is as pink as your hair. You really are a cherry blossom, Sakura-chan. He snickered a few times until she growled at him reflexively, so used to his childish antics that her lips were peeling back almost before she thought about it. Shut up, Naruto. I'll knock your head off. Luckily for him, her attention was quickly diverted by a hum from Samui and an approving smile. I like a woman who can stand up for herself like that, her soulmate told her in a throaty voice. Sakura nearly melted. She hadn't much liked these Kumo shinobi when they met, but first impressions could often be wrong. Flushing even deeper as she realized she was still holding the other woman's hand, Sakura thought to herself that she was more than willing to give them all a second chance in light of this new development. Chapter 148, Kiba Gara, the one where you have a tattoo of how you will mate. Mustering up his most dramatic and heart-wrenching whine, Kiba draped his upper body over the glass case displaying different flavors of muffins. At his feet, Akamaru echoed the noise and turned in a pathetic little circle. Ino stared at him without changing her expression, whipped cream in hand but no mercy to be found in her eyes. No, his friend denied him in a deadpan voice. Kiba whined again. Oh come on, please. I've got to study for this test or I'm gonna flunk hard. So? I don't see why you care about school anyway. Ino dropped her gaze pointedly to his arm before flouncing away to grab a shaker of chocolate sprinkles. One twist of whipped cream and 2 delicate shakes of sprinkles later, and she had created a masterpiece. Kiba snatched it up with a glare. I don't want to work in the cafe forever, he growled. Just until I meet my soulmate. Then Yeah. No. Then you going to be somebody. Ino folded her hands under her chin and flooded her eyelashes. A second later she dropped the sugary smile she had plastered on and returned to the same deadpan expression she'd been wearing since this conversation started. Kiba hoped she never found out just how scary he actually thought she looked like that. He would never hear the end of it. Iron. So come on, please. Please take my shift tomorrow. I will owe you so much. Not a chance. I've got a date tomorrow and I'm not canceling. Maybe Choja will take pity on you. HMPH. I hope you choke on Sakura's tongue, Kiba grumbled, snatching up his drink and stepping aside when he heard the bell over the door give a cheerful ring. When he came back from break he was so going to spill something on her and pretend it was an accident. Without even bothering to check on who came, and he bent down and scooped Akamaru off the floor. He was damn lucky the owner of their sleepy little cafe was so obsessed with dogs. Kakashi never minded if he brought Akamaru to work with him as long as the little guy didn't cause any trouble with the customers. Holding his fluffy friend in one hand and a ridiculously sugary drink in the other, Kiba marched over to the most secluded seat available, stuffed his headphones in his ears, and pulled open the notes he'd made on his phone last week in class. Maybe if he read them over enough times at least half of it would stick in his brain and he wouldn't fail the dumb test coming up. Several customers came and went as he dutifully studied, some of them staying and others hurrying away with their precious caffeine the second it was ready. None of it registered on him. His ears were full of heavy metal and his head was full of the musculoskeletal system of an average house cat. Being a veterinary assistant had better be worth it when he got there. Akamaru yipped and licked at his ankle when Ino began to glare at the back of his head, the usual way he knew his break was up. With a heavy sigh he stood to slip his headphones back in his pocket and tie his work apron around his waist. Green tea frappuccino. Ino was calling. Patting his thigh to make sure Akamaru followed, he began to edge around the seats that had filled up while his head was buried in lecture notes. Green tea frappuccino. Kiba looked up in amusement at the sound of his co-worker's voice, not wanting to miss seeing the irritated face that would go along with her sleepy time. Most of the people working here were college age and constantly low on sleep, but Ina was the most famous for her short temper. She was especially annoyed by people who couldn't bother to wait for their order in the right place. He was almost disappointed to have the show end early when she caught his eye and jerked her chin at a guy standing over by the fireplace, admiring the decorative pottery lined up on the mantel. Not much of him was visible other than bright red hair and an unseasonable sweater. The guy had to be half mad at least to be wearing extra layers in this heat, but Kiba wasn't here to judge. He was here to serve people overly fancy drinks in the hopes of finally fulfilling the soul words on his arm. You will serve him at a cafe, they said, and so Kiba had dutifully gotten a job as a barista. Not wanting Ino's temper to turn on him before he earned it himself, Kiba hustled over to the counter, tossed his own empty cup in the bin, then scooped up the bright green drink and turned towards the fireplace. The guy hadn't moved much farther than the next piece of pottery. I think this is yours, man, Kiba said from behind him. Akamaru skidded in front of the stranger and yipped a few times in greeting. When he turned around, Kiba very nearly dropped the plastic cup in his hand. It wasn't just that he was gorgeous, smooth skin and sharp features and a tattoo so cold that rendered Kiba dumb and immobile. It was the instant connection as soon as they saw each other and the warmth on his arm which told him that he had done it. He'd found his soulmate after nearly 6 years of serving endless assholes their drinks. It's you, the guy breathed out in awe. His voice was low and raspy and so damn hot. Do you want your drink? Immediately he wanted to drop his face into his hands. What a stupid thing to say. What idiotic first words. Kiba was half a second away from expiring due to sheer embarrassment when the guy denied him with a shake of his head. No, thank you. I don't like green tea. Then wait, what? Why did you order something you don't like? His answer was hidden under the guy's sleeve, messy words scrawled in brown ink that read, "He will greet you with green tea in a dark." Kiba couldn't help it. He started to laugh. I guess that's why you came into a cafe called Pups and Cups, huh? Yes. My name is Gara. His soulmate offered a bashful smile. May I know yours? Kiba. It's really great to finally meet you, Gara. Are you, by any chance, free this evening? He couldn't seem to quit staring at the vibrant red shade of Gara's hair or the cute little cacti dancing on the sleeves of his sweater. Just as the other opened his mouth to answer, Ino's voice cut across him with a screech. Kiba. Quit chatting up that poor sod and just give him the damn drink. Your break is over, loser. He was spun around with his free fist shaking across the room at her with barely a thought. Can't you see I'm meeting my soulmate over here? Give a guy 2 seconds, Dan. Sticking out his tongue to drive his point home, he turned back to the conversation. Sorry about that. She's right though, I'm supposed to get back to work right now. Are you free later? Can I have your number? We should, go out sometime. Yes. I am free and I would very much like to get to know you. Kiba. The little pause in the reverent way Gara whispered his name was possibly the most precious thing he'd ever seen. Awesome. Great. Yeah, all right. Grinning stupidly, Kiba handed over his phone for Gara to add himself into the contacts list. Then he spent a few seconds just standing there taking in all the details he could. It was going to take some time before he got over the hair. He would have to remember to ask if it was natural. And he was definitely going to need the story behind the tattoo because it was the coolest thing ever and super hot. Kiba wondered if there were any other tattoos for him to find. Waving goodbye and going back to work like normal was hard, but at least he had something to look forward to at the end of his day now. They agreed to meet when his shift was finished and chat over a couple of whatever drinks Gara actually enjoyed, and then Kiba was slipping back behind the counter, practically glowing with happiness to Ino's obvious chagrin. So, he drawled. Any chance you'll cover me for tomorrow now? It's still an hour. You're a heartless bitch, you know that. Ino blew him a mocking kiss. And you love me that way. He didn't bother to deny it. The rest of his day passed like molasses until finally he spent the last 5 minutes of shift loitering by the syrup fridge and staring at Gara, who had come back and was tentatively playing with Akamaru while he waited. Clearly they were meant to be. When he sat down in the corner this time, it was with 2 black coffees and the determination to memorize an entirely new kind of subject matter. He learned that Gara lived most of his life in the desert and thought Konoha was cold even in the summer, that his tattoo was in memory of the hard times he'd seen in his younger years, that he had 2 siblings he'd reconnected with only just recently. All this and more he absorbed, and when they parted ways they shared a kiss, and he learned one more thing. This was love. Chapter 149, Hashirama Obada, the one where their thoughts of you are on your own. For nearly 26 years Hashirama believed himself to be without a soulmate. Not once had he ever seen another person's thoughts scrawled across his body, no matter how often he looked or how closely he inspected himself. It was a bit of a sore spot for a man who so deeply believed in true love and the entire convention of soulmates, but it wasn't something he could change, and Hashirama knew that. Eventually he simply made his peace with the hand he had been dealt and moved on. That all changed about a month before Madara finally accepted his offer of peace. He was sparring with his brother, shirtless and sweating, when he happened to notice something dark on his arm that shouldn't be there. Thinking it was only a bit of blood, he ignored it until Tobirama fell eerily still with both eyes trained on that same spot. "Anija," was all he said, but his tone was heavy and it prompted Hashirama to look down. Red ink, just a few shades too bright to be called bloody, ran up his arm with haphazard strokes and poorly formed kanji, the hand of someone who had only received the barest amount of training and proper calligraphy. At first all he could do was stare in wonder. For years he had dreamed of this, and now here it was, ostensibly the first thought his soulmate had ever had of him. It took a minute or so of staring before he even thought to read the words that had appeared, and he only just managed to catch them before they faded away. "I suppose now I will never know what happened to them." Hashirama blinked, only half aware that Tobirama was helping him settle shakily on the ground with his back against a tree. Nothing about that sentence made sense to him, but it mattered little at the moment when all he could focus on was the fact that he had a soulmate finally, after so many years of thinking himself all alone in the world. Just as he was able to catch his breath from the shock, it all rushed back out of him when new writing appeared, red ink and messy kanji drawing the same words over and over again. "They're alive, they're alive, they're alive, they're alive, they're alive." On and on it went. Each time the words faded, there were only a few seconds before they were back again with the same refrain. Suddenly it wasn't such a mystery why his soulmate had never devoted much time to thinking about him before. Clearly they thought he was dead for some reason. It was strange that they wouldn't have seen his thoughts about them, but hopefully that was something they could figure out when they finally met. He desperately hoped they would meet. A month later he had no more information about his soulmate than that they were still alive, but he did have a ceasefire agreement with Madara's signature on it, another dream that had stayed with him since childhood. His old friend attributed his capitulation after so many years of stubbornness to a man Hashirama had never met before, and Uchiha, a few years younger than him, with an eye patch and half his face covered in twisting scars. When he tried to approach the man, however, he was rebuffed with gruff, confusing words about taking too long the first time. No amount of grubbiness could spoil his mood, though. Not when the Senju and the Uchiha finally had the chance to live together in harmony as he had always wanted. He barely had time to catch his breath between fits of joy over the next few months as the village came to life before his eyes. It was hardly surprising that Tobirama reviewed everything over his shoulder, down to the smallest detail, lest he forget something, but what oddled him was how often the man Obida bulled his way into things, demanding that something be changed or done another way, always stressing that it was the right way. None of the changes he insisted upon were negative ones, so Hashirama didn't really mind, per se, but he did wish he knew what the man's parameters were for right and wrong. Madara and Azuna always nodded along with him sagely, but they never bothered to explain anything either. Sometimes Hashirama curled up at night after a long day of chaos and thought about his soulmate as hard as he could, with as many sweet thoughts as he could think of. Even in this madness he could never quite set aside the notion that they had thought him dead all these years. He desperately wanted to make up for lost time. In return he often found stray thoughts written on his arm throughout the day. His so kind came to him one day just after a meeting where Obida and Tobirama had bickered over how much space to leave for any clans that might wish to join their venture. He was tired from keeping both of their tempers abated with soft words, but seeing his soulmate's thought about him put a little spring back in his step. "I would love to hold his hand" showed up while he was mingling with a group of people from both clans, drinking and chatting and making merry in celebration of the first buildings going up at last. Hashirama peered into his sleeve every 2 seconds as he waited for it to fade away, and then continued to smile until his gaze fell upon Obida's grubby scowl, and he hurriedly rearranged his face into something less dirty. Obida was something of a mystery to him. He had asked 100 times, but Madara was still vague on why the man had never shown up on the battlefield before, why no one in the Senju clan had ever heard of him. Despite lacking one eye, he seemed to be fairly competent. His bad moods never seemed to have any particular sort of trigger, or at least not one that Hashirama could figure out, but on one thing he never wavered. Obida was determined that Konohagakure come into being and that it stand as a beacon of peace for all. And that was something Hashirama could admire. If only he could convince the man to stop scowling at him every time they spoke. He could never tell for certain whether Obito disliked him or not. Sometimes they were able to talk to each other just fine, but then he would smile or do something innocuous and Obito would suddenly tense up and go red with anger, stomping off in another direction while he grumbled under his breath. Hashirama was never sure what he had done. Every time he tried to ask how he had given offense, hoping to avoid doing the same in the future, it only seemed to offend the poor man even more. Luckily, those incidents somehow always seemed to coincide with the stray thoughts he caught from his soulmate, so at least he usually had something to cheer him up again. Right around the time the marketplace had been built and construction was beginning on some of the residential areas, Hashirama was surprised to have Obito seek him out for the first time. He was taking a Tobirama enforced break, sitting in the sunshine and admiring the red writing currently scrawled across his arm, when a shadow fell across him and made him look up. Obito was staring at his soul words. "I hope he smiles at me," they said. Something about that seemed to bother Obito, but not in the usual way. Instead of upset, he looked awed, like a child watching their first letters appear mere seconds before 100 questions burst forth all at once. But instead of 100 questions, Obito had only a statement. "I was just thinking that," he admitted quietly. "About you." Hashirama blinked at him, uncomprehending. "You were hoping I would smile?" Well, yeah." Obito shifted his weight and turned his head away. He looked like an awkward kid confessing his first crush, and Hashirama wondered why he couldn't stop comparing this fully grown man to young children. Probably because he looked so darn cute, all flustered the way he was. When Obito stiffened and lifted an arm to push back his sleeve, Hashirama never would have guessed he would see his own thought reflected back at him in hurried brown ink on too white flesh. "He looks so darn cute, all flustered the way he is." Both of them stared at the words, just letting it sink in for a moment. Then Obito looked up and Hashirama felt himself flushing from hairline to chin. As he always did when he was embarrassed, he began to babble about the first thing that came to mind and as usual immediately dug himself even deeper into a hole. "Well, you do look cute when you're flustered, I can hardly be blamed," he insisted. "Not that I get to see you like this very often. I always seem to upset you somehow, although I can never figure out how, so you can understand my shock." "Hold on, you think I'm upset with you?" Obito cut in. "Yes. Every time I talk to you, you get all angry and red and then you stomp your feet when you leave." Hashirama poked his fingers together nervously as he waited for it to happen now. He was confused to see Obito flail both arms in the air, spewing disconnected syllables and half-words for a few seconds until finally he managed to string them together. "I wasn't angry. I was embarrassed." Hashirama tilted his head to one side. "About what?" Obito only spit out a few more garbled vowels, but his thoughts betrayed him anyway. The letters on Hashirama's arm had faded during their conversation, but with his sleeve still pulled back they were both able to watch new ones stretch themselves out across his skin. "I think I love him and that terrifies me." Despite the evidence right in front of his eyes, it still took until Obito whimpered and hid his face behind both hands for Hashirama to realize at last what was going on here. His eyes flickered back and forth between the red ink bearing such adorable words and the man in front of him wearing such an adorable blush, and then a loud gasp slipped out when it all finally clicked together. All of his dreams had come true right under his nose, and he wasn't sure he ever would have noticed if they hadn't had this conversation. "We're soulmates," he chirped happily. "HNNGGGG. This is amazing." That seemed to shake Obito out of his stupor, hesitance clear in the uncertain set of his jaw. "It is." "Of course it is," Hashirama said. "You're here, I'm here, we are soulmates. And you love me. It's everything I have ever wanted. Don't you think that's pretty amazing?" "Well, when you put it like that." Nodding sagely, Hashirama smiled and clasped his hands together. It seemed like his soulmate needed a moment or two to absorb everything that was happening, and he was more than willing to wait patiently for a few minutes, at least. Patience had never been his strong suit. At least now he wasn't worried about how he seemingly kept offering offense. Obito appeared to deal with his emotions in a similar way to how Tobirama did, by getting angry at them and running away from the source. That was much easier to deal with than anger. Hashirama had lots of experience trying to calm down a man panicked by his own feelings. "So, if we are soulmates, then there are a lot of things you should know about me," Obito told him. Hashirama smiled and reeled him in for a hug without responding. Nothing the man could possibly tell him would tarnish his happiness at finally being together with his soulmate, and getting a hug first was much more important. The big heavy conversations could wait a minute. Chapter 150 Special Edition. 101 Yamato and Naruto, the one where you can see your future in their eyes. Hey, what do you want to name our kid when we have one? Yamato looked up from the book he was reading to blink slowly at the young man across from him. We've been dating for a month. Don't talk to me about kids. But we're supposed to have kids. You saw her too, yeah? When our eyes first met. Naruto leaned forward eagerly, dropping the mission report he was supposed to be writing in favor of this ridiculous conversation. Yamato rolled his eyes and pointedly lifted his novel higher until his face was nearly hidden behind the pages. It was a potential, not a certainty. And, I repeat, we have only been dating for a single month. I believe it's still just a little bit early to be thinking about children. You still can't even take your shirt off without blushing. Don't go biting off more than you can chew, you know. He lifted one eyebrow in the sassy manner he would deny having copied from Kakashi, hiding a smile when it earned him an insulted half. His partner was more adorable than he wanted to admit. Naruto crossed both arms and sank down in his chair. What, you don't want kids? I said nothing about wanting or not wanting. But you implied it. Did I? Look, do you want kids or not? Yamato gave an and cracked a smile, marking his page, then tossing the book aside so he could gesture his boyfriend closer. Naruto was still pouting, but that didn't slow him down at all as he threw himself across the room to sprawl bodily across Yamato's lap. She was pretty cute, Yamato admitted quietly. And she had your eyes, which means she would be spoiled as hell, of course. I wouldn't be able to resist. Sounds dangerous, in my opinion. Dunno, that sounds pretty awesome to me. Naruto squirmed, all but purring when Yamato carded fingers through his blonde hair. Tell you what. Ask me again when we've been dating a little longer than a month and maybe we'll talk about it. Silence followed his words, a silence so accepting and content that Yamato felt compelled to follow up his statement with a little more clarification, just in case. And by that I do not mean 2 months. Damn it. 103 Tobirama Baruka, the one where you see them in the corner of your eye. Tobirama was the sort of man who got shit done. If the sheer amount of things he had accomplished in his first life hadn't been enough of a clue, it was made obvious now by how many upheavals he caused in the first month of having been brought forward in time. Iruka felt as though he'd done nothing more than blink, and suddenly the academy curriculum had been re-evaluated, village security had fixed several oversights, and the hospital staff were over the moon to have a man of such genius tinkering around in their laboratories. Several advancements in science were expected to be published soon, considering his reputation for invention. Iruka watched it all happen with a beatific smile on his face. Not much had changed about his everyday life. He went to class and taught his students, he sat in the mission room and handed out assignments or welcomed back their returning soldiers, he ate at the ramen stand with a frequency that bordered on addiction. What changed were his evenings. Before they had been admittedly lacking, usually filled by marking homework assignments and watching crappy television dramas. Now every night found him curled in one corner of the couch with a tea in hand as he listened to Tobirama recounting the day's adventures. As the tales unfolded, he would think of the way he had watched the new shadow in the corner of his vision, the ways it had moved, danced, and matched it to whatever event his soulmate was telling him about. Sometimes Tobirama would come out of his own head long enough to ask about Iruka's day. Other times he would go on for hours, excited about the research he was getting approval for or the experimental seal he had recently designed. Iruka was happy either way. For most of his life he had convinced himself that he was glad not to have a soulmate, grateful not to be distracted by movement in the corner of his vision at all times. Now every night as he sipped his tea and let Tobirama's deep voice wash over him, he realized he'd been wrong. The shadow was never a distraction, it was a promise that new adventures were waiting. 108 Obito Kakashi, the one where you have the color of their hair on your wrist. Waking up from a coma felt a lot like someone slowly turning up the dial on a radio. Of course, Kakashi wasn't aware at the moment that he was waking up from a coma, just that he had been unconscious and was slowly returning to the rest of the world. Sounds came back to him first. From somewhere close he could hear something giving off faint beeps at regular intervals, not enough to be too annoying but just enough to keep him from being able to fall back asleep. Closer to his feet he could hear a deep voice murmuring, familiar tones humming a familiar tune that had his lips twitching, although he was unsure whether he wanted to smile or grimace. It didn't matter how old he got, his father would never stop singing him the same old lullaby that had rocked him to sleep as an infant. He only realized that something might be wrong when he tried to open his eyes and sit up, tried being the operative word. His body didn't exactly respond immediately, and Kakashi struggled a little harder as a flash of worry ran through him. Peeling his eyelids apart was more strenuous work than it should have been, as though they had been glued together, and he grunted with the effort of it. Kakashi. Footsteps told him that his father was hurrying closer just before he felt a large hand carding through his hair. Son. Sakumo's voice was oddly wavering, and Kakashi wondered what might have made him cry. Now more determined than ever, he grunted once more before finally convincing his eyes to crack apart and blink woozily up at the ceiling above him. That definitely wasn't his bedroom ceiling. Where the hell was he? A moment later Sakumo had bent over him, cupping his face in both hands, and pressed their foreheads together as he sobbed unending thanks to any higher power he could think of. Kakashi didn't really understand why, but since his mouth didn't seem to want to do more than goggle, he simply lay still and waited for the storm to pass, worried and hoping an explanation would be forthcoming. His left arm didn't respond when he tried to move it, but his right did, if only just. Slowly he convinced his fingers to stretch out, and when his father let go of his face to take that hand, to hold tightly in return. "You're awake," Sakumo murmured. "I can hardly believe it. That's just like you to keep us waiting." Even through the tears he was smiling wider than Kakashi could remember since his mother passed away. "NNGG." Trying to speak again, and him a shaking head and more hair petting. No. Don't try to talk, young one. I'm sure they'll take the breathing tube out soon, but until they do, let's not disturb it. We can ask the nurse about it, okay?" Kakashi frowned, fingers trembling as the clues slowly started to come together. Sakumo did what he could to keep him calm, telling him about the accident which had landed him in the hospital, being truthful about how long he'd been in a coma because he knew how Kakashi hated it when things were kept from him, and relaying every scrap of hope the nurses and doctors had given him over the last several months. By the time his breathing evened out again, Kakashi was caught up on all the major events that happened during his long sleep and had been reassured over a dozen times that everything was going to be okay. He almost believed it too. But it seemed that Sakumo was not done dropped surprises in his lap yet. He hummed in curiosity when his father suddenly grinned with excitement and sat up, leaving only a single point of contact for the first time since he'd woken up. "I met someone a few months ago that I think you will be very excited to meet for yourself. But first, the proof." Leaning off the bed for a moment, he came back with a can of colored hairspray which had evidently been hiding on the windowsill. "I know how much you've always liked colors, so I brought you some. You just didn't look like you without any, not when you still hadn't found them. But if you would but direct your gaze over here a little." Following with his eyes to see where the man was pointing, Kakashi finally looked down at his own body. It was immediately apparent why his left arm wasn't responding. There was a skinny boy around his own age fast asleep on top of it, curled up into his side with a lax, peaceful expression. The boy had black hair and fine features, his thin lips parted just a little and twitching as he murmured through a dream of some kind. One of his long legs was curled up while the other dangled off the end of the bed between the raised safety bars. The dangling leg was covered in the thick blue walking boot given to those who had broken a bone in their lower leg or foot. He had one untucked into his own chest and the other thrown across Kakashi's midriff, carelessly showing off the stripe of pretty silver around his wrist. After allowing him a few moments to stare in shock, Sakumo drew Kakashi's attention back to the can of red spray in his hand. "You always said you'd find them with your color," he reminded the young man. Kakashi swallowed thickly. "And I know how much you like to see the proof of things with your own eyes." With no further ado, Sakumo shook the can and sprayed a little into Kakashi's hair. Keeping his eyes riveted in the wrist thrown across his middle, even though he was half expecting it, it was still a shock to watch as the stripe on the boy's wrist slowly darkened to red on one side to leave it jewel-tined. Then he felt tears pricking at his eyes again. This boy was his soulmate. Frantic beeping played in his ear as the monitors picked up his increasing heart rate again, but Kakashi paid them no mind. He looked to his father with a mixture of emotions he couldn't even begin to define, unable to express any of them until the breathing tube had been removed. His name is Obito, and I think I should let him tell you his story. Sakumo gave him a gentle smile, bopped his nose like he was still 3 years old, and pointed him back to the sleeping boy, who, it seemed, was no longer quite so asleep. As they watched, Obito scrunched his eyes closed and hummed, fighting his way out of some dream or other. His striped wrist curled back towards his face to scratch at the stubble just barely starting to grow in, and then he blinked both eyes open. Out of habit, it seemed, his gaze went first to Sakumo. When he saw how emotional the man was, that was when he finally turned to see that the one he had fallen asleep against was awake at last. And then Kakashi watched something amazing happen. Obito smiled, his face lit up like dawn breaking across the sky, more joy in that expression than Kakashi was sure he'd ever witnessed on any other face before. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He thought to himself quietly that the universe really knew what it was doing. 110 Hashirama, Madara plus Azuna, Tobirama, the one where you are stuck together on first contact. Hashirama had only just lifted his smile to the stars outside when a sharp chin dropped onto his shoulder with perhaps a little too much force. Even after all these years of peace, Madara had never been able to curb his instincts toward violence even in the smallest of movements. I guess I'm glad I got stuck to you, the man grumbled in his ear. Hashirama blinked in surprise. You mean stuck with me? He asked. Madara sighed loudly, a heavy sound filled with enough exasperation to make an angsty preteen jealous. I'm saying I guess I'm glad we are soulmates. You're not the worst thing that could have happened to me. Maybe. Oh, I love you too. Hashirama was smiling widely with tears in his eyes as he snuggled back against the pointy elbows digging into his back. It never bothered him that Madara preferred to cross his arms and lean forward rather than wrapping them together in a good cuddle, though that was usually because he got his cuddling in after Madara fell asleep and unconsciously sought out his warm embrace. Irritated huffing was his only answer, but that was nothing new. That was about as good as Madara declaring he felt the same in return. If he protested at all, he would not have been shy about saying so loudly. Unfortunately, there wasn't much time for Hashirama to bask in the soft, loving moment between them. The atmosphere was entirely broken when the closet door swung open and both of the younger brothers spilled out with laughter on their lips. Is the score Uchiha in Woof? Tobirama simpered, mockingly fluttering his eyelashes at the both of them. Brother, be nice. Fuck you, Senju. Gross, not even if you weren't covered in Hashirama's germs. Tobirama wrinkled his nose in disgust. Hashirama tilted his head, cutting off his own retort with a curious hum. Brother, what are those marks on your neck? And what on earth were the two of you doing in that closet? Were you in there the whole time? His curiosity only rose when Azuna began to laugh. We're glad we got stuck together too, was all he said before catching a now blushing Tobirama's arm and pulling him from the room in a hurry. Alone again, Hashirama and Madara gave each other matching befuddled looks until the light of understanding dawned in Madara's eyes and he began to scream. Hashirama watched bemusedly and wondered what the big deal was. Shouldn't they be happy their brothers were happy too? 111 Kasame Sakura, the one where you can't lie. Examining her nail beds with the sort of concentration she usually reserved for difficult surgeries, Sakura sighed despondently. One of them was broken. Clearly this travesty was much more important than the hard stare she could feel drilling into the side of her head from the woman on the other side of the desk. Have you lost all sense of propriety? Tsunade asked her in a low, deadly tone. Sakura shrugged. Maybe. Underneath her, Kasame snickered. The Hokage of the leaf spared him a sharp glare as well before returned her gaze to the young woman she had taken under her wing several years ago, who now sat perched on the lap of a known member of the Akatsuki, legs crossed primly and one hand lifted to mourn her broken Nio. It isn't like you to trust so easily, she said, trying for a different angle. And here she had thought Sakura might never hit her teenage rebellion stage. Tsunade would have been sort of proud if she wasn't already so irritated. Oh, that's easy. Sakura twisted in Kasame's lap and fluttered her lashes at him ostentatiously. Do you have any intention to harm Konohagakure or its inhabitants now or in the future? Not unless they hurt you first, girlie. There, see? He can't lie. Dropping the Sakuran act, Sakura made herself comfortable again and went back to examining her nails. Clearly that too was an act, a display to make clear to everyone gathered just how confident she was in the decision to place her trust in this man and the other one standing rather uncomfortably behind her chair. Itachi didn't seem to know what to do with the starry-eyed gazes Naruto wouldn't stop giving him. After learning the truth of the Uchiha's past, Naruto had been following him around like a puppy ever since, constantly asking his opinion on how to find Sasuke, where to look for Sasuke, what they should say to convince Sasuke to come back to them. Sakura had been tired of it in the first 5 minutes. She was more than glad to make those two idiots someone else's problem now that they had returned home. "Are we good, then?" she asked. "I've got some questions I'd like to ask my soulmate, but we'll need a little privacy for that. You heard him, he's no danger to the village. Can we go?" Tsunade considered being difficult just to show her student she was still the one in charge here. And maybe to get a little preemptive revenge for the headaches she was surely going to suffer when the council found out she was letting 2 international criminals run free without their borders. But she remembered well the distraction of finding her own soulmate, how hard it had been to concentrate on anything else for the first couple of weeks, and she found herself sighing as she waved one hand dismissively. Both of these new additions would be invaluable sources of information. If the price of that information was letting one of them get a little handsy with her all-too-willing apprentice, then, well, she could afford to be patient for one night. She would use the time to figure out whether she should rescue Itachi from Naruto's affectionate clutches or if she could possibly use the boy to annoy more information out of their new triple agent. 113 Hashirama, Izuna, the one where you see through their eyes in times of danger. Izuna was in the middle of an important meeting with one of the Hatake Klein representatives, going over security needs for their integration with the growing village, when his words choked to a stop and his entire body went rigid. Without warning, his vision was suddenly transposed over with an image of the easternmost training field, his own brother's face coming towards him with a familiar manic gleam in his eyes. Madara only looked like that when he was having fun in an all-out spar or in battle when he was crushing his enemies like bugs. Wasn't Madara sparring with Hashirama this morning? Izuna could swear he remembered his brother mentioning it at breakfast. His fingers were trembling when he snapped back to reality, back inside his office to find the Hatake representative looking at him with one eyebrow up and one fan hanging over his lip. Usually Izuna found the sight of him embarrassingly terrifying, but now he gave no thought to shoving the papers he was holding into the man's chest and babbling some sort of nonsense excuse as he scurried over to the window and spilled out onto the roof, launching himself away to the east with enough force to crack the tiles underfoot. Knowing intellectually that there were soulmates was one thing. Seeing through another person's eyes and knowing it could be no one but Hashirama was another. He would have been thrilled at the confirmation if not for the fact that it meant his own brother had come close to killing his soulmate. Did they even realize it? Probably not, he decided, dropping down at the edge of a field that lay in tatters and catching sight of their matching childish grins of delight. By the state of the ground and the sheer number of charred wooden shapes twisting through the air, it was clear they had been at it for a while. Izuna dodged between 2 spires to tackle his brother without bothering to warn either of them that he had arrived. If they weren't paying attention, that was hardly his fault. He didn't even feel guilty when Madara's chakra flickered with a brief moment of panic. He made Izuna panic first. The fuck dash? Madara's yelp cut itself off as he scrambled to twist in midair for a proper landing that wouldn't send both of them tumbling end over end. His feet skidded several feet across a miraculously untouched patch of grass before he came to a stop, arms held wide to avoid contact between brother and blade. Izuna shoved him again as soon as they had gotten their balance. "You almost killed him," he shouted. "How could you be so reckless? Aren't you two supposed to be friends? Do you want to kill your best friend, Aniki? Well, I certainly don't want to kill you. What were you thinking leaping in between us like that? I already said you almost killed him. How else would I have seen you through his eyes? And I was busy, you idiot." Izuna snarled wordlessly in an effort to express how absolutely enraged he was, baring his teeth like an animal. Then he spun around and took hold of a stunned Hashirama's hand to drag him away from the practice field. "Next time be more careful. It was just a spar, you know, not an actual battle." He ignored Madara's spluttering protests, storming off with Hashirama in tow and his eyes set angrily forward, not really heading anywhere other than him away. It wasn't until he had stomped halfway home with vague thoughts of safety in his head that he realized the man he was toting along behind him was being strangely docile about the whole thing. When he stopped and looked back, Hashirama was staring at him with awe in his face, eyes wide and lips parted in a dreamy smile. It was disturbingly cute for such a large man. "You were worried about me," he said. Izuna swallowed down an attack of sudden nerves. "Well, yeah. I've never seen through your eyes before. You're strong enough that your life has never truly been in that much danger before, and it may have freaked me out a little. May have. But Madara was the stupid one for taking a friendly spar so seriously. Of course he almost manages to kill you only after we are at pace." The tiver he was clearly working himself into was halted in its tracks by the finger squeezing his iron. Izuna blinked in surprise to realize they were still holding hands. This time it was him that allowed himself to be passively led forward right into Hashirama's chest. "Thank you for worrying about me. And no problem. May I kiss you, Izuna?" Clearing his throat, he tried for a casual shrug and murmured, "I mean, we've already kissed once. I guess it's not a big deal or anything." Hashirama was reeling him in almost before he was finished speaking. Several minutes later, when he was able to gather his thoughts, Izuna conceded that they really do this more often. The kissing, not the almost dying. 114 Shisui in Naruto, the one where the sunrise illuminates the last place they touched you. Enthusiastic kisses peppered all around his face worked Shisui out of a very nice drain. He smiled as he blinked into the darkness, more than surprised that Naruto was even awake at this time. Instead of asking questions, he hummed contentedly and reached out blindly until he found a warm solid body to draw in towards himself for a proper kiss. "Wasamada," he slurred. Thick fingers tugged at his hair and he stretched happily. "I wanted us to watch the sunrise," Naruto whispered in his ear. "Haven't seen you awake before the crack of noon since the first time we watched the sunrise together. Are we marking some sort of special occasion I've forgotten about?" He would have put more energy into being worried about offending his boyfriend, but the fingers in his hair were working their usual magic, tugging on his springy curls and digging into his scalp with just the right amount of pressure. Naruto didn't sound upset about any missed dates. There was laughter hidden in his tone as he squirmed atop Shisui's chest and said, "Yeah, we are marking the occasion of your face." With no more warning than that, he slapped one of his oversized hands down over Shisui's nose, sitting up immediately afterwards and yanking the curtains open. Shisui jerked upright with a yelp and caught sight of himself in the mirror on the back of his closet door, most of his face glittering as though his skin had been encrusted with diamonds. He scowled to hide his amusement, baring his teeth, but the second he moved, Naruto was up off the bed and thundering down the hall, trailing laughter behind him. Shisui fumbled with the blankets tangled around his legs, trying hard to wipe the smile off his face so he could look stern while he shouted at his partner. "I'll mark your ass, Naruto." "Yes, please," the other man's voice came back to him faintly. Now fighting the urge to drop his face into his palms, Shisui was still snickering when he caught up to Naruto. He just hoped the neighbors weren't awake to listen to the ruckus they made in the kitchen. 115 Shikako of Minada, the one where you feel their emotions. Dinner was a resounding success. Shikaku based this opinion entirely around the fact that Minato never once looked bored, even when the conversation centered around the intricacies of Kuri politics for a solid hour. Amazingly enough, he even had a lot of good points to make himself. Shikaku wondered if it was weird that debating the merits of different systems of government made him blush. After both of them had eaten perhaps one too many bowls of ramen, they took a walk through the Nara forests and fed deer with breadcrumbs from Shikaku's pocket. Somehow they ended up sprawled on the grass side by side, and at Pinky's brushing, Minato's voice a quiet hum that floated no farther than the airspace around them as he chatted about his plans to perfect the Rasengan. Despite strenuously efforts to keep his attention on their conversation, Shikaku could only give himself the 10th pep talk in as many minutes, trying to work himself up to shifting his hand over and weaving his fingers into the one sitting right next to his arm. He nearly choked on his own tongue when, with a light sigh, Minato rolled over onto his side and leaning in to grace him with a light kiss. "There we go," Minato chirped. "Now you can stop feeling nervous." "I beg your pardon." "You were nervous. And your fingers were twitching too. So I thought I'd get that out of the way for you, and then you can just, kiss me whenever you like." His smile drooped into a worried frown. "I hope that's okay." You weren't super determined to kiss me first or anything, right? Kushina kept telling me I should wait until you were ready to do it first, but if I do that then you might take 2 years again. Shikaku stared up at the other man, fighting back his own embarrassment. How could he have forgotten that Minato would feel him working up the courage to make the first move? Not that he was upset to have someone else do the work for him. Do that again, he whispered. Minato's grin returned, as bright as ever and happy to indulge him. 116 Minato Madara, the one where you can't injure your soulmate. Madara liked to throw things when he was angry. Actually, to be more specific, Madara liked to throw things at Minato when he was angry. The most important things this had taught Minato was that laughing while his soulmate was having one of his little temper tantrums was a deadly mistake, extending the time until the man calmed down by hours more. It was just so cute. Of course Madara knew that he could never hurt Minato no matter what he threw, and Minato knew that was sort of the point. It was a way of satisfying his need for destructive violence without hurting anyone and keeping the property distraction to a minimum. But watching him use the ghostly form of Susanoo to rip entire trees out of the ground and hold them across the field only for his projectiles to bounce harmlessly off the air several feet away from Minato was, well, it was funny. Way funnier than when he threw books across the office that usually landed gently in Minato's lap. A sudden lack of bouncing trees caught his attention, and Minato looked up from calmly reading his novel to find Madara heaving for breath over where the tree line used to be. Now it was a small extension of the field, covered in potholes from all the foliage he'd uprooted. Minato snapped his book shut and hopped up, strolling over towards his partner with a casual air. If this was what it took to keep the man's temper in check without causing chaos, then he was fine with it, no matter the Senju brothers' protests. He never got hurt and it wasn't personal, he knew that. Susanoo faded more and more with every step closer until only Madara was left, arms crossed and face turned stubbornly away. Minato stopped in front on the other man with a gentle, cautious smile. Feeling any better, he asked. Madara snorted, although Minato noted that he didn't deny it. I'm sure Hashirama will be more than happy to set this place to rights for you. You know how much he loves any excuse to grow a few new trees. Yes, I suppose you are correct. Gradually the tension in his shoulders began to dissipate, though he still kept his face turned away. He was always adorable and embarrassed after every tantrum. Shall we go home then? Minato held out his hand and waited patiently. He was rewarded with the careful slide of Madara's fingers between his own. To this day that remained the best reward he could offer the other man in times of need, a fact that never failed to make his heart flutter when he thought about it. They might be married now after a very long and very proper courtship, but Madara, sweet under the rough edges, wanted nothing more on some days than to hold his hand and avoid his gaze so that Minato might not see the endless affection hidden there. Minato always saw. 117 Sakura Hinata, the one where everyone has wings and your colors match your soulmates. Hayashi did not approve, that much was obvious from the moment he laid eyes on the exposed colors of his daughter's wings. The expression on his face darkened impossibly the moment Sakura stepped in front of Hinata, her own wings spreading protectively and her arms opening as if to make a physical barrier against the hurt of a father's rejection. Come here at once, he ordered, deliberately speaking past Sakura's head like she wasn't even there. She doesn't have to go anywhere she doesn't want to. You don't own her. Sakura lifted her chin. No one would ever speak ill of her soulmate again without answering to her wrath. You should be on your knees thanking her for giving you the love that she does after everything you've done to her. You should be begging for her forgiveness. You don't deserve her, Hyuda-san. At her back, Hinata tipped her head forward to rest in against one of Sakura's shoulder blades, taking shelter in her partner's strength. They had spoken to Shikamaru for hours about legalities and clan traditions. She knew the things she needed to say to her father, and she'd known before coming that it would be hard. Clenching her fists, Hinata raised her head and took a deep breath. Yes, this was going to be difficult. But she had Sakura here with her, and she would never not have Sakura again from this day forward. Just knowing that was enough to give her the courage to stand up straight again and look her father in the eye. We have much to talk about, she told him, voice unwavering. Sakura would tell her later that it was the moment she realized Hinata was the most beautiful woman in the world, no matter how much Hinata protested that she'd been standing behind her partner at the time. 119 Shikamaru Sakura, the one where you share a limited stack of sticky nights. It wasn't the same as finding them in any old random place throughout the day, but it still made Shikamaru smile every time he came across another sticky note with familiar writing on it. Sometimes he thought about asking how she found the time to sneak into his office and leave them on his desk, but he never did. Letting her keep this mystery wouldn't hurt anything, and what if him asking embarrassed her into stopping? They were the best part of his day. He grinned as he lifted the small pink square of paper, deliberately chosen so as not to be confused with the yellow ones they both still kept in locked boxes under the bed they shared. Sakura's handwriting was as neat as ever, but the words she left him were positively filthy sometimes. "What's that?" Naruto asked, trying to peer over his advisor's shoulder. Shikamaru folded the note and slid it into his pocket for safekeeping where no curious eyes could investigate further. "My evening plans," he murmured. Naruto whined about being left out of the loop, but Shikamaru ignored him. His thoughts were full of Sakura already. 120 Izuna, Tuka, the one where you know when your eyes first meet. Izuna promised himself he would wait until his brother was in a better mood before saying something. He went over the clan's account and calculated the increase in food costs this month. He looked in on those who had been injured in the skirmish and made sure they had all received treatment. He even popped down to the communal kitchen and asked the chefs to add some menrizushi to the menu that evening in the hopes that it would keep Madara in high spirits. Or at least repair his spirits after he heard the news. At some point he had to admit he was stalling. Still, it took several minutes and countless laps around his bedroom to work up the courage, phrasing and rephrasing how he was going to say this. Madara hadn't even been on the battlefield today, and from what Izuna heard he hadn't even left his room since noon. What if he was feeling sick? If he was already feeling unwell, then delivering a shock such as the one coming to him surely couldn't be a good thing. Izuna clenched his fists and teetered on the edge of accepting his own excuse. Before he could chicken out entirely, Izuna forced himself to dash from the room, down the hall, and pound his fists on Madara's bedroom door, calling through the wood just to get the words out. "Wake up, Aniki. I found my soulmate and it's a senju. That scary woman around your age with the big muscly arms. She's my damn soulmate." "She what?" Izuna froze. That was not his brother's voice. Several thumps met his ears, followed by hurried footsteps before the door was thrown open and Izuna was staring into a familiar face which very much did not belong here. Tobirama had a hickey on his throat, he noted in a daze. "Tuka's your soulmate," his rival demanded. Madara appeared over his shoulder, seemingly unconcerned with the enemy standing in his bedroom doorway, his shirt on inside out and his hair in wild disarray. When Izuna failed to answer, the two of them made identical noises of impatience and waved for him to keep talking. "She'd better be worth this crap," was all he could say. He had no way of knowing at the time that a year later, when Tuka finally heard about what he said that day, it would be the cause of their very first serious fight and the catalyst that made him realize she most definitely was worth it. 121 Madara, Tobirama, the one where their emotions are written on your wrist. The slamming of their front door wasn't surprising at all when Madara's wrist had been stabbed with the word irritation for that past 2 hours. He'd considered wandering over to the Hokage Tower to see what had his partner's undies in a bunch, but quickly discarded the idea. Days off were rare for all of them. He was hardly about to squander his hard-earned downtime when Tobirama was perfectly capable of dealing with his own problems. If it was something actually serious, then the emotion displayed on his wrist would have been more serious as well. Madara carefully wiped all traces of a smile from his face as Tobirama's chakra approached, rearranging his expression into sympathetic curiosity just in time for the Enderman to stomp into the room and throw himself bodily down on the couch. If his head happened to end up pillowed on Madara's thigh, then surely it was only because he happened to be in the way, certainly not because his reticent partner was attempting to seek comfort in his own stupidly nonverbal way. What was he doing this time? He's a moron. Tobirama shouted, voice muffled by the meat of Madara's thigh. Why did we allow such an idiot to become the Hokage? He can't do any of his paperwork right, which of course means I have to be the one who rewrites it all. Ah. I did warn him that if he didn't get it all done yesterday, you would be angry with him today. Evidently he did not listen. His soulmate made a noise of disgust and pressed harder against him until Madara relented, skimming his fingers up the side of that long pale neck and tracing the shape of his favorite delicate little ears. Tobirama's ears were so tiny and it never failed to amuse him. No matter how much the other man denied it, he was convinced the only reason Tobirama had grown out his hair in this signature shatty style was to cover up his tiny little ears. Or maybe it was so nobody would play with them, Madara thought with a smile, watching Tobirama melt under the sensation of rough fingers tracing and prodding. "You're home earlier than I thought you would be," he noted out loud. Tobirama groaned in response and said nothing. "It's barely even dinner hour. Hashirama must have been able to get more paperwork done yesterday than I thought if you're able to get away already. I gave up and sent him home with the last of it. And a note for Mida to make sure it gets done." Madara cackled. He wasn't very fond of Hashirama's wife, but he did enjoy how strict she was about her husband finishing any work he brought home. He made a mental note to tease Hashirama about being whipped tomorrow and then set those thoughts aside in favor of the warmth blossoming on his other wrist. Without stopping the hand soothing his poor tired soulmate, Madara peeped at the letters on his other arm to check on the man's emotional state. Something like love or happiness or some other gross emotion choked his breathing when he saw how the word there had changed. As worked up as Tobirama had been when he made it home, the word for him now read content, and Madara frowned to keep the mist in his eyes at bay. "Who said I wanted you all flocked on top of me like this?" he demanded. "What are you, a cat?" Tobirama refused to answer. Instead, he used his feet to kick off the other end of the sofa and shove his body farther on top of Madara until the older man groaned in defeat. "Fine. Fine. Just don't be all smug about it." "And what reason have I to be smug?" Tobirama asked, pointedly turning his wrist so the word happy was easily visible to them both. Madara snarled and turned his head away even though he knew it would do nothing to hide the blush on his face. The man in his lap only purred softly in response and closed his eyes, looking very much like he was settling in for a long nap. Madara squirmed briefly but gave in after a few huffs, making a grand show of his reluctance to settle down, and then he busied himself playing with Tobirama's ears again. All things considered, Tobirama knowing he was happy wasn't the worst thing in the world. At least he could see that the feeling was mutual. 124 Kakashi, Tobirama Obida, the one where proximity heals you. Growing up with an older brother who had no concept of personal space meant that Tobirama was woefully familiar with the sensation of waking up to find extra limbs in his bed, usually thrown across his back because his mattress was really only meant to hold one fully grown adult, not two. With so much weight on top of him at the moment, he could only assume that his brother had gotten into a fight with Mida and was sulking by sleeping directly on top of him. Tobirama grunted, snuffled, and even rippled a little in an attempt to dislodge his idiot sibling, but the only result he got was fingers tightening in his hair and something warm constricting around his leg. Odd, that. It felt almost like there were too many limbs involved here. He squirmed again, then froze when a voice that was very much not Hashirama's grumbled in his ear. "Quit it. G back to sleep." Snapping his eyes open, Tobirama was greeted with the sight of silver hair just a few shades off from his own and a pair of droopy gray eyes still fogged with sleep. He's never been a morning person, Kakashi told him with a smile. Memories flooded in and Tobirama felt a rush of warmth pulling in his chest all over again as he remembered the night before when he had discovered that he had not one but two soulmates waiting for him. How the three of them had all fit into his bed together without one of them falling off in the night was a mystery. Knowing it was Obida who had spoken so grouchily in his ear made him smile reflexively even before Kakashi wriggled forward to slip underneath his chin and wrap him up in the only limb that wasn't already locking him into place. Tobirama couldn't remember the last time he had enjoyed cuddling with someone, and yet here he was sandwiched between two other men and he couldn't think of a single place he would rather be. Here was home. From this day forward, home would always be wherever Kakashi and Obida were with him. 125 Madara, Tobirama, the way you see color only where they touch. Your house is all in color and mine isn't. That was all he had said. In his mind it was nothing more than an idle observation, but it seemed Tobirama had taken this as some sort of challenge. Madara couldn't remember the last evening he had slept alone, having spent every night for the last several weeks with his head pillowed on the other man's chest. And every night before they went to bed he watched with mixed feelings as Tobirama hunted through the house, trying to find something he hadn't touched yet, never asking but always peeking sideways to see if Madara reacted to something new lighting up with color. Everything in Tobirama's home showed up in brilliant shades of colors Madara didn't even have names for. Until recently there hadn't been much in his own home that looked anything but black and white. Now it looked like a box of crayons had gotten loose and exploded everywhere. His bedspread was purple, his curtains were green, his favorite mark was red, his couch was a god-awful shade of mustard yellow. It was sweet in its own way. Madara wasn't going to deny how it touched him, watching Tobirama make up for the waiting he had done by showing him all the colors he was living with. On the other hand, it was also a little disturbing. He was a grown man and his world had been black and white for almost 30 years. Now he was brewing potions with colorful ingredients that distracted him with their shifting hues and researching new spell books only to spend 15 minutes contemplating the rich brown of the leather cover. It was sweet, but it was also strange to feel like he was only now seeing all of his possessions for the first time. Still, Madara smiled as he watched Tobirama skirt around the edges of his bedroom, tucking his arms above his head and biting his lip when the man froze underneath a shelf holding some old junk he'd been meaning to get rid of for years. Like a bloodhound on a scent, the man tilted his face up and eyed a small wooden box that probably only held some burnt-out stubs of incense. Palefinger reached up carefully to brush along the edges, red eyes peered curiously over one shoulder, and Madara tilted his head curiously to know that the wooden box was painted blue. The mischievous light in Tobirama's eye said he chose it for that color alone. Tobirama lacked blue. "Come to bed," Madara called softly. "That box isn't nearly as pretty as you are." 128 Madara, Tobirama, the one where scars on them show up on you. Tobirama met him at the gates as soon as he made it home. Madara wondered wryly if his lover had been specifically watching for him or if he had felt the familiar returning chakra and scrambled to intercept his arrival as quickly as possible. Either way, he did not look happy. It was hardly a surprise when the man grabbed him by both arms and whisked them away before a single word passed between them. The moment their bodies appeared in the bedroom they shared, Tobirama was pulling frantically at his shirt. "Anywhere else?" he demanded. Madara sighed and allowed himself to be manhandled, clothes falling away piece by piece. "Nowhere else." He tried to make his tone soothing rather than exasperated. By his partner's expression, he was fairly sure he didn't manage as well as he'd hoped. "Do you know how worried I was to wake up with a new scar that size? And you out of the village with no word on when to expect you home or if you had been captured or anything." Tobirama's hands were strangely gentle despite the iron grip when he pulled their bodies together, clutching Madara tightly even as his lips spit vitriol and dark curses without pause. Madara closed his eyes and smiled, let his head rest calmly on the other's shoulder to wait out the storm. He'd been expecting this sort of welcome. Knowing that such excessive worry was born of love gave him the patience to wait calmly for Tobirama to wear himself out until they were left standing in silence at long last, arms locked around each other in a foam grit and goose flesh rising on Madara's skin. It was a bit late in the season to be standing around naked. "I'm cold now," he grumbled when he was sure his partner was calmer. Tobirama huffed, hands sliding lower, caressing instead of inspecting. "My apologies. Allow me to help you warm back up." Now that, Madara thought, was a proper welcome. 129 Shina, Karen, the one where when you cry they cry. Karen was lifting her arms with slow, deliberate movements when a voice from behind almost startled her off the ladder she was standing on. Thanking her lucky stars that she hadn't actually touched the hive yet and disturbed the creatures within, she turned to look over her shoulder, glaring at the idiot who almost just ruined her careful planning. To a great surprise, Uchiha Sasuke stood behind her with his arms folded and the same old petulant frown on his lips. There was a time when she had thought that pout was the most attractive thing she had ever seen. That was before Shino grew out his hair and learned how to make his eyes smolder as he pushed her down on the couch in their living room. "What the hell are you doing?" he had asked. Karen lifted one eyebrow, noting that he didn't seem to recognize her. "I'm moving this hive. Some of the neighbor kids have been throwing rocks at these poor things, so I'm going to move them to a tree in the backyard where they'll be safer and we can keep an eye on them." "That's stupid," Sasuke told her with a sniff. "You just asking to get stung. Who the hell wants bees in the backyard?" Karen closed her eyes for a moment and repeated the mantra Shina had given her to help keep her temper. "Wild bees are just as important as cat bees and they only sting if they feel threatened. Any idiot can learn how to be non-threatening, although most idiots don't care enough to learn." He seemed to realize that she was directly insulting him, although she would bet her last paycheck that he didn't fully understand how. She rolled her eyes as he opened his mouth to retort, but they were both interrupted when the front door opened and Shino stepped out onto the front porch. His hair was down but his sunglasses were firmly in place as always, his head tilted curiously when he saw that she had not yet retrieved the hive. Although she couldn't see his eyes, she could feel them skating over her to read her body language before shifting over to the man standing at the base of her ladder. "Oh. Hello Sasuke," he called. "It has been a long time since we last met." "Why?" "Because we have not kept in contact with any of our less desirable acquaintances from high school." Karen bit her lip in amusement, her chest swelling with affection. Her husband was the king of throwing shade and she would never tired of that flash of pride she felt listening to him sass people. Sasuke, on the other hand, didn't seem to appreciate it. "The fuck? Who the hell? Perhaps you do not remember my wife, Karen, or I." "Karen?" Sasuke swung around to stare at her and his expression was so satisfying that she began to laugh. And then she couldn't stop. Karen clung to the ladder with one hand and curled the other around her gut, almost afraid it would split open with the force of her merriment. Without a care in the world for how she looked, Karen laughed and laughed and laughed until every bad memory of her time in high school was shaken loose, scattered to the wind as dust and leaving her without a weight she hadn't even realized still pulled her down. When she was able to straight up again, she was wiping tears from the corner of her eye, turning instinctively to admire the pearly sheen of the sympathy making its way down Shino's cheeks as well. "Yeah, it's me," she said finally. Oddly enough, the words carried no sting and no hatred. Sasuke was ancient history now, and no matter how many bad memories she carried of him, they hadn't been able to stop her from finding happiness elsewhere. "I can't say it's good to see you, but you know what? Thanks for the laugh. You want a bee? Get the fuck away from me, you hippie." "A bee? Well, now I'm really glad we didn't fuck in high school." Karen shrugged once more and opened her hand, releasing the curious little thing that had landed in her palm to check for pollen. "You're lush," she murmured. It was strange to realize that she meant it. From across the yard she caught Shino's tiny smile and returned it, content. She didn't need anything more than what she already had right now. 130 Hashirama, Tobarama, the one where you have their name on your wrist. "Dearest Okasan, I am writing again as I promised I would. Do be sure to tell Kana what a truly dutiful daughter I am. Perhaps she will follow my example and write you a few letters of her own. Life in the Senju compound is vastly different from back home in so many ways, but the strangest thing remains the bond between my husband and his brother. They move as if they share one mind, one train of thought. I have never seen the like in any other pair of soulmates. Did I mention that in my last letter? I can't remember. You read that correctly, Mother. The Senju brothers are indeed soulmates to each other. I'm not certain how I feel knowing that I will never be the most important person in my own husband's life, but it's still a better situation than most women could hope for in an arranged pairing. Still, it was quite a shock to spot such a name on Hashirama's wrist during our first night together as husband and wife. I can see that my first impression was correct. Finding my place here will be difficult if I cannot make my way into Tobarama's good graces. The way he has looked at me ever since my engagement to Hashirama was announced makes me wonder if he thinks I intend to come between them. I will need to have a gentle, diplomatic conversation with him. That is all the news for now, I'm afraid. Send Obasan my love and remind her to take her medicine. Lovingly. Mida. 131 Madara, Kakashi, Tobarama, the one where you have a telepathic link. As he rocked the knife back and forth, chopping a few herbs for the fish he'd pulled out for dinner, Kakashi was hard-pressed to muffle his delighted chortles. If he listened hard enough he could almost drown in the frustrated confusion of his two soulmates, but did he feel like offering them some help? No. Not a damn chance. It wasn't like he had any more experience with babies than they did. Is it supposed to do that? He heard Madara ask from the living room. How the fuck should I know? Tobarama replied, followed quickly by the thought, you idiot. Oi. Kakashi bit down on his lip and pushed the herbs to one side, pulling open the drawer to his left in search of the deboning knife. At least one of his soulmates was sure to love his choice of entree for tonight. The other would just have to suck it up. Maybe if he was good, Kakashi would make some inner Izusha for them all tomorrow. Maybe. We can still feel you laughing, Tobirama's voice grumbled in his head. I'm trying to be polite about it, he protested mildly. What is the baby doing now? Making bubbles, came Madara's answering scream. Kakashi lost his composure, nearly losing a toe when he dropped the knife he'd only just found but barely noticing amidst the waves of laughter. Both of them snarled at him through their shared connection, but he couldn't stop himself even if he wanted to. I think the baby is fine. He was forced to tell them silently, unable to speak at the moment, and the relief he could feel from both of them only made him laugh all the harder. Times like these made all the hard days dealing with two such full-time men so worth it. 134 Kakashi, Hana, the one where you hear their thoughts about you. Damn, he's good at that. Kakashi preened a little without opening his eyes, body languid and loose where they were both spread out on the kitchen tiles, ego more than happy to listen to her thoughts about his performance. One of Hana's feet gave him a light kick without any real force behind it. Now he's gonna be all smug. Of course I am, Kakashi drawled out loud. You keep thinking about how amazing I am. What can I say? That thing you do with your tongue is pure genius. I've been called that before, he mused. Hana rolled her eyes and stretched her limbs out, groaning quietly with relief when something in her back popped. Then she rolled over and straddled her soulmate's hips with a lecherous grin. Round 2. I promise I'll be thinking about you the entire time. She squealed with delighted laughter as Kakashi surged up to embrace her, mind already racing through several images that had him growling with renewed want. 139 Izuna, Idama, the one we feel each other's pain. Izuna squirmed under the combined weight of his big brother's stare and Idama's. Until now he had rather conveniently neglected to mention the reason behind his sudden change of heart towards the idea of pace. Now he was Madara ratting him out in front of the Senju just to make everyone stare at him together, pressuring him into a confession. He wasn't particularly ashamed of his connection to Idama. Actually, he was rather intrigued, if he were to be honest. The Senju was pretty and clever, and his adorable sass was actually kind of a turn-on. The only reason he hadn't said anything to Madara yet was that his brother had loose lips where Hashirama was concerned, and Izuna was maybe a little terrified of what the other Senju brothers' reactions would be when they found out that precious Idama was matched with him. Well, the reason I was advocating for peace, Izuna nervously rubbed the palms of his hands together, not even caring that he was projecting his emotions so obviously. A wave of relief washed over him when Idama came to his rescue with a smile. This might be a bit of a shock, so please try to keep your heads. The other boy gave a pointed look to both of his siblings. Izuna and I discovered that we are soulmates. As expected, Hashirama and Madara gasped in unison. What no one expected was the bored expression on Tobirama's face or the casual way he shrugged and murmured, I already knew that. What? Izuna gaped at his rival and Idama flailed both arms adorably. How did you know? The Senju demanded. Tobirama lifted one eyebrow at his younger brother as though the answer should have been more than obvious. I've been meeting Izuna in battles since we were children. Did you think I hadn't noticed the way he seemed to come away with pain in the same places I managed to wound him? There's a reason I hold back my strength against him just as Hashirama does for Madara. You have not been holding back. Izuna snarled. There was no way. He refused to accept the idea that Tobirama was anything but evenly matching to himself. Frustratingly, all his stupid rival did was smirk and say no more. Their oldest brothers, on the other hand, appeared to be losing their minds. Madara was still trying to pick his jaw up off the ground. Hashirama took a brief moment away from gibbering with either happiness or despair. It was so hard to tell with him to take Idama by the shoulders and shake him while blubbering some sort of nonsense about becoming a man and building brighter futures. At least, that's what Izuna thought he could parse out between the tears and the sobbing hiccups. As much as he hated to draw attention to their situation, he only lasted a minute before he had to ask. Listen, could you stop shaking him, please? You're making me dizzy too. This is supposed to be a peace meeting, not a scramble my brains meeting. He regretted his words immediately as Hashirama turned to him with a watery smile. Welcome to the family. Idama's delighted laugh turned out to be worth getting covered in Hashirama's tears. 140 Gara Naruto, the one where marks on your soulmate's body show up on your own. What's this one from? Gara looked up from the trade agreement he was supposed to be reading over, tilting his head as he racked his memories for the answer to his soulmate's question. I believe that is from a border dispute with a Wagakure. A most infuriating opponent who used some sort of light Kikagen guy to bend perception. She was very difficult to capture. Ha. And this one? Shirtless and sprawled across the window seat, Naruto dragged his finger over to another scar he had asked about a dozen times already. Gara didn't really mind telling him again. Any time they spent together was precious. If talking about their mirrored scars again was really what the other man wanted to do, then he was fine with that. My first near-death experience, he said softly. About a year after we met. Poison in the air slowed me down enough for the man to get inside my guard and drive a kunai into my belly. It hurt, he added as an afterthought. Naruto rolled his eyes. Yeah, getting stabbed usually hurts, Tabaya. Peering closer, Gara tried to determine whether the man was mocking him or not. It was still so hard for him to tell sometimes. No matter how many questions he asked his older siblings or how many hours he spent getting lectured about proper behavior, he was still very confused about a lot of human interactions. He comforted himself with deciding that Naruto was not mocking him, if only because he knew he wouldn't understand why if he asked about it. Setting aside the agreement he was making no headway on, Gara slid out of his seat and padded over to where Naruto was poking at a scar on his chest that looked sort of like someone had pinched the skin and twisted it back into itself. What's this one? He asked. Gara smiled as he brushed Naruto's fingers away and placed his own palm over the same spot. That one is yours. It is? From when you angered Sakura and... No, Yera, remember now. We don't have to talk about it. His soulmate turned his head with a light flush and Gara felt his smile widen. Leaning down, he brushed a light kiss over those warm, tan cheekbones. What was that for? Nothing, Gara admitted. I love you. Oh. I love you too. Naruto was suddenly beaming at him and Gara wished he could live a life of nothing but simple moments like this one. 142 Madara, Tobirama, the one where their opinion leaves marks. After sitting so long in silence, enjoying the cool of the evening long after the sunset they'd been watching had been replaced by the moon, Madara's voice cut across the space between them like a blade despite how quietly he spoke. You have to know that I already know, right? Tobirama resisted the urge to sigh, keeping his head facing stubbornly forward and clenching his fists to hide the way his limbs had begun to tremble. He knew very well his companion expected some sort of answer, but all the words in his mind were suddenly gone and his throat had never felt so tight before in his life. Eventually Madara sighed and tugged fitfully at his hair. I mean, you already know how I feel about you. And you're not so unaware of yourself to not know your own feelings, so you must know that my scars have healed as well. He twisted and Tobirama could feel those dark eyes boring into him. If you feel the same, then I don't understand why you haven't said anything. We should be together. It looked like just saying something so blatantly emotional had cost him a great deal, but Madara had proven himself to be unafraid of taking risks if he calculated the rewards to be high enough. For that, if nothing else, Tobirama owed him the truth. After what I put you through, I simply cannot bring myself to say it. Say what? That you love me. Tobirama nodded once. It's hard to put into words, he admitted. It isn't just that I feel I don't deserve you, although that's part of it. No, wait, that makes it sound like I'm not considering your opinion on the matter, and I am, truly. It's just that after what I did, no matter what I feel now, I'm not sure that I would be enough to make you happy. And what? You gonna change into a better man so you can deserve me? Madara snorted in the most derisive way possible. What a stupid notion. Tobirama gave a little sigh to disguise his smile. Not quite. Neither of us is the sort of person to change easily. Oh, so you're saying I'm not worth changing for? For fuck's sake, would you let me get the whole thought out before you jump on it? Tobirama finally looked over at his companion, glaring for a moment before rolling his eyes. All I meant was that I've already hurt you a lot, and now I want to take my time to make certain that I will never do that again. I make mistakes when I rush into emotional things. I don't want to make another mistake with you. Madara chewed that over for a few minutes in silence, clearly trying to find something wrong with it. Finally he hummed and leaned over to ostentatiously drape himself against Tobarama's side. "Well, you certainly are taking your time. Do you take suggestions? Hurry the fuck up. I'm getting impatient." Then he growled in mock offense when Tobarama gave a startled huff of laughter. "I will take that into consideration." Cautiously, so slowly he almost wasn't moving, he reaching out to slip one hand into the cuff of Madara's sleeve and run his fingers over the smooth warm flesh inside, skin that he knew was pale and unmarred by even the slightest discoloration. His intention had been to not treat this thing between them like one of his science experiments, but Madara's words made him realize that perhaps he should have done what he was best at a long time ago: take a leap of faith. 143 Kakashi, Obito, the one where you have a journal that connects you. Obito wondered if the massive wooden gates leading into the village had somehow gotten smaller, or if they just looked that way because he had grown in the months he'd spent away. It was easier to concentrate on that than to look at the naked suspicion on Kotetsu and Azumo's faces as they all waited for the Hokage to arrive and confirm his identity. With no Zetsu to wrap around him for support, he'd been forced to slump down to the ground now that he had reached his destination, the adrenaline of determination finally wearing off to leave his knees shaking and weak. One of them was still only half healed to the white flesh he had been rebuilt with. It was sort of galling not to be able to stand for his own homecoming, but since his comrades apparently had thought him to be dead. This whole time he was fairly sure they wouldn't care much. They'd probably just be happy to see him at all. He looked up with a smile as two dark shapes flickered against the light of the moon, catching his eye just in time for him to watch Minato-sensei and Kakashi drop down from the rooftops together. Or, he assumed that was Kakashi. It felt like his teammate's chakra, but the face was hidden behind a painted A&B mask and the stance he held himself in was more rigid than ever. Obito held back a giggle at the disbelief rolling off both of them, settling his eyes on the young A&Bu with familiar spiky hair. He would have to get the story later on why anyone thought it was a good idea for Kakashi to join up with such a dark organization, but that would have to wait. Slipping his journal out from where he had stashed it underneath his shirt, Obito held it out towards his soulmate and grinned brightly. "I told you I was coming home," he said. Any doubts about the A&Bu's identity were dispelled when he came forward and fell to his knees in front of Obito and reached out to reverently stroke the cover of the black journal. His fingers traced the top edge before gently opening the cover, no one present speaking a single word until Kakashi drew a tremulous breath that ended with a quiet whimper. "Obito. It's really me. You're alive. How are you alive?" The hand fondling his journal lifted to reach out towards him instead, pausing to hover hesitantly a mere inch away from him face. He shrugged. "It's a long story. Can I tell you after you greet me properly? I mean, where's all the excitement about us being soulmates or whatever?" The words were hardly past his lips when Kakashi broke, not so much tackling him as collapsing into him and pulling him in tightly against a thin-armored chest. Obito noted that the idiot had lost some weight even as he closed his eyes and reveled in the first warm human contact he'd had since getting injured. Madara wasn't exactly the cuddly type. Not that Kakashi usually was either. His supposed death must have hit the other harder than he'd thought because he'd never seen Kakashi hug anyone in all the time they'd known each other. "Take me home," he mumbled into his soulmate's neck. Kakashi had him swept up into two strong arms a moment later. Minato-sensei flooded around them with 100 questions all pouring out at once, but Obito was already slipping down into unconsciousness. He was warm and safe and back where he belonged, and he trusted his soulmate to watch over him until he was ready to face the world again. 146 Tobirama, Azuna, the one we must ask them. As infamous as he was, Tobirama was known for several things. He was known for his proficiency with water jetsu, for his incredible speed and the Horatian seal that many mistook for speed, for his prowess in battle and his ability to defeat any stack of paperwork no matter how high. What he was not known for was his ability to comprehend and dissect his own emotions. Izuna seemed to think it was funny to chase him around the village until cornering him somewhere he couldn't escape and capturing his mouth in heated kisses. He thought it hilarious to leave little gifts on Tobirama's desk, dreadful gifts that horrified him with how thoughtful and useful they were. The man practically glowed with mirth as he showered Tobirama in heartfelt compliments, asking him in-depth questions about the research no one else usually bothered to care about, and it was honestly more terrifying than any of their battles ever had been. How was he supposed to react to any of it? It made his inside squirm and his head spin. He'd taken to carrying a thermometer everywhere he went just to be certain he wasn't catching a fever. There could be no other explanation for how often he felt hot blood filling his cheeks. Even stranger that it wasn't only when Azuna was close but also whenever someone tried to ask him about the other man. For lack of any better way to deal with these strange new developments, Tobirama had called into work today. No matter how he tried to schedule his day so that he wouldn't be anywhere near the current bane of his existence, Azuna still seemed to pop up everywhere he went. Even here, apparently. It was well past sunrise when he finally dragged himself out of bed, long after everyone else should have been at work, yet here he was shuffling into the kitchen to find Azuna there with his feet kicked up on another chair and his hands running through the hair he had left out of its usual ponytail. Tobirama felt his breath catch in his chest as he watched the way those silky black strands seemed to cascade like a waterfall, kissing the sides of Azuna's graceful neck and shining like water where they caught sunbeams from a nearby window. The man wasn't even facing him, yet Tobirama couldn't help but think that here was the most beautiful creature he had ever seen. "Oh," he breathed, catching Azuna's attention. "Oh, I see. Good morning, my little nervous squirrel. Thought you could hide at home." Azuna turned to smirk at him triumphantly, but Tobirama only continued to stare in wonder. "What?" Like a man making a grand discovery, Tobirama declared in an awed whisper, "I love you." His guest choked and dropped his feet from the chair. "What? I see. That's why I feel so strange around you. I love you. You? But I didn't." Azuna stood and flailed his arms, spinning in a little circle like even his feet didn't know where they wanted to go, so Tobirama helped by stepping forward and guiding the flustered man into his arms. It felt just as good as it always did to press their lips together, better still now that his head was clear, but the best part was when he pulled away to see that for once Azuna was the one rendered stupid with a raging blush covering his face. Tobirama felt no shame for smirking and dusting a light peck across the tip of his soulmate's nose. "How kind of you to help me understand such a wonderful thing. Truly you are what you said you would be, the best soulmate I could possibly hope for." Azuna only gurgled in response, but Tobirama chose to just take that as agreement. 149 Hashirama, Obito, the one where their thoughts of you are on your own. "So you went back in time," Hashirama began hesitantly. At his side, Obito nodded with a frantic sort of nervous energy, making the movements jerky. "Yes. Because one of your best friends killed the girl you used to be in love with, which made you abandon Konoha for a couple of decades. Yes. Although before you went back in time your plan was to put the entire world under a massive genjutsu to create a perfect world where you would be able to see that girl again and everyone would be happy right up until this god tree sucked their chakra dry." Obito winced, but he still nodded once more and gave a perfunctory yes. And this plan was all thought up by Madara, who lived well past 100 years old, by somehow adding my DNA to his and attaching himself to the tree thing. Who thought up the plan because in your original timeline Tobirama killed Azuna in battle, which drove Madara cuckoo. Yep. Old geezer. Hashirama sat back in his chair and let his eyes shift out of focus, mind drifting as he let all of the information he'd just been given sink in. It was a lot. And most of it was crazier than even Tobirama's craziest theories, which was saying something. Hashirama was very careful to turn it all over in his head and examine everything from all the possible angles he could think of. Several long minutes had passed by the time he was done, and Obito jumped like a startled deer when Hashirama turned to grace him with a brilliant smile. "That's all right," he declared. What?" "I said that's all right. I'm okay with all of that." "You are?" "Yep." Hashirama nodded enthusiastically and drew the other into a tight hug. Going back in time to fix everything before Azuna died was such a better way to deal with things than to put the entire world under a genjutsu. In a way, you saved Madara's life too when you did that. Thank you. From the sounds of it, Konoha owes you a great debt. Obito took a slow, deep breath in. Acceptance? Huh. This feels really weird. Not at all liking the implications he got from those words, Hashirama huffed and drew Obito in tighter. He would have to make sure he spent the rest of his life making sure his soulmate felt accepted, wanted, loved.